It began with thunder, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. In the pre-dawn hours of April 16th, 1945, the horizon east of Berlin ignited with the light of more than 9,000 Soviet guns. The air trembled, the ground shook, and the night was torn apart by fire. For hours the bombardment raged, a ceaseless roar that turned the German front line into smoke and dust. This was the Battle of Seelow Heights, the last great battle of the Eastern Front, a clash not of strategy, but of will. It was the moment when the Red Army came face to face with the gates of Berlin, and the Third Reich, gasping in its final days, made one last stand upon a ridge of blood and mud. What followed was not just a battle, it was the reckoning of a nation, the breaking of an empire, and the dawn of an ending written in fire. The Seelow Heights were no more than a series of rolling hills along the Oder River, 40 miles east of Berlin, a strip of elevated ground stretching across the German frontier. Yet in April 1945, they became the most vital terrain in Europe. Whoever held them controlled the last barrier between the Soviet armies and the German capital. Behind those ridges, Adolf Hitler still dreamed of miracles. He believed Berlin could be defended, that his soldiers, his boys of the Volkssturm, his shattered divisions could hold the tide long enough for the West to fracture its alliance with the East. But the war had already passed the point of hope. The Red Army was coming, and nothing could stop it now. Commanding the Soviet assault was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, hero of Stalingrad, conqueror of the Eastern Front. To his south, Marshal Ivan Konev prepared a parallel strike toward Dresden, while Rokossovsky's armies pressed from the north. Together they fielded over 2.5 million men, 40,000 guns and 7,000 tanks, the largest concentration of firepower the world had ever seen. Facing them, General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's most skillful defensive commanders, held the army group Vistula, perhaps 100,000 exhausted troops, with dwindling supplies, crumbling morale, and orders from Hitler to hold the line or die where they stood. Heinrici knew what was coming. He could not stop it, but he could make it bleed. In the days before the assault, the Germans had flooded the Oder Valley, turning it into a swamp of mud and water. They dug trenches, laid mines, and fortified every ridge. The Seelow Heights became a fortress, lined with artillery and anti-tank guns. For the Soviet soldiers staring west across the misty plain, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. At dawn on April 16th, when Zhukov's guns opened fire, the noise was unlike anything the world had ever heard. The bombardment lasted for nearly 2 hours, a storm of steel meant to erase the German line completely. But Heinrici had pulled his troops back just before the shells fell, sparing much of his defense. When the Soviet infantry advanced through the smoke and dust, they found not ruins, but resistance. Then came the fog, thick, impenetrable, and treacherous. The Red Army's spotlights, meant to blind the defenders, reflected off the mist and illuminated their own troops. The battlefield became chaos. Soviet tanks bogged down in the marshes, their tread sinking into the flooded fields. German guns opened up from the ridges, turning the plain into a killing ground. Anti-tank shells screamed through the haze, striking steel with blinding flashes. Soldiers fell by the thousands. For every yard gained, blood paid the price. The Red Army advanced, but slowly, painfully slowly. Zhukov's men expected a breakthrough in hours. It would take days. By the second day, the battlefield had become a vision of hell. The air stank of fuel and cordite. Burned-out tanks littered the valley. Soviet medics worked knee-deep in mud, dragging the wounded through swamps under constant fire. The Germans fought with a ferocity born not of hope but of defiance. old men and boys, soldiers without fuel or food, holding every ridge and trench until they were destroyed. Soviet artillery pounded them relentlessly. Entire divisions were erased, but still the Seelow Heights held. Zhukov, desperate for progress, threw in his reserves, tank corps, shock armies, wave after wave of men and steel. The sky filled with the roar of Katyusha rocket launchers, their trails painting red arcs across the morning light. The noise was deafening. The ground itself seemed to bleed. By April 18th, Zhukov's patience snapped. His rival, Konev, to the south, was making faster progress toward Berlin, and Stalin was watching closely. For the Red Army's greatest general, failure was unthinkable. He ordered an all-out assault. The Soviet guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Aircraft from the 16th Air Army bombed the ridges without pause. Then, through the smoke and fire, the Soviet tanks surged forward again. The 1st Guards Tank Army, the 2nd Guards Tank Army, the 8th Guards Army, a tidal wave of armor and men. The German line, stretched beyond endurance, finally began to crack. By evening, Soviet troops reached the crest of the heights. The defenders fought to the last, snipers firing from ruined houses, machine gunners fighting until their barrels melted. By the night of April 19th, the Seelow Heights were overrun. The road to Berlin was open. The cost was staggering. In just 4 days, the Red Army suffered over 30,000 casualties, some estimates even higher. Thousands of tanks and vehicles lay destroyed in the mud. The Germans lost nearly all that remained of their strength. Heinrici's defences were annihilated, and his soldiers retreated in broken columns toward Berlin. Behind them lay a wasteland, villages levelled, forests burning, rivers running red. The victory was total, but it was bought with unimaginable sacrifice. The blood that soaked the Seelow Heights would feed the final act of the war. Within 10 days, Soviet forces would be fighting in the streets of Berlin itself. For the soldiers who fought there, the memory of Seelow was unforgettable. Soviet veterans remembered it as the hardest battle they ever faced, harder even than Stalingrad or Kursk. The Germans who survived spoke of the thunder, the endless shelling, the smell of the earth as it burned. It was not a battle of heroes, but of endurance, a clash where human will met the limits of flesh and fire. When the guns finally fell silent, there was no triumph, only exhaustion, relief, and the grim realization that the war's end would be as terrible as its beginning. The Battle of Seelow Heights was the last gateway to the fall of Berlin, a battle that marked the death of the Third Reich and the cost of its delusion. It was the last stand of a nation built on conquest, brought to ruin by the same fire it had unleashed. The soldiers who fought there, Soviet and German alike, were caught in the machinery of history, their lives ground into the mud of the Oder Valley. And yet, in that inferno, courage remained, the endurance of those who kept fighting, the strength of those who survived, and the silence of those who did not. Today, the Seelow Heights are quiet once more. The ridges are covered in green. The river flows again, indifferent, carrying with it the memories of that April beneath the grass. The scars remain, the trenches, the shell holes, the bones. The battlefield has become a memorial, a place where the noise of war has faded into the whispers of history. Tonight, we return to that ridge of fire, to the fog that glowed with artillery, to the roar of engines clawing through mud, to the moment when the world's most terrible war reached its breaking point. This is the entire history of the Battle of Seelow Heights, the last stand before Berlin, the storm that broke the East, and the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Before we begin, tell me, Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you listening beneath quiet skies, far from the thunder of guns, or imagining that final dawn as the horizon burned above the Oder? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. January 12th, 1945, along the frozen Vistula River near Baranów-Sandomierski, Poland, the thunder of more than 10,000 Soviet guns shattered the winter dawn. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front launched the Vistula Oder offensive with a ferocity unseen since Kursk. Soviet engineers had assembled pontoon bridges under cover of night, their wooden planks sheathed in ice, allowing waves of T-34-85 tanks and Katyusha rocket trucks to surge forward. Each division carried detailed maps printed by the General Staff Cartographic Department, marked in red for key German strongpoints, blue for rivers, and black for rail hubs. Behind the assault units, columns of Studebaker US-6 trucks, delivered under Lend-Lease, hauled ammunition and fuel drums by the thousands. German defensive lines collapsed within 48 hours, their positions overrun faster than headquarters could issue withdrawal orders. By January 17th, Warsaw fell to Soviet forces with little resistance, its ruins barely recognizable from the city Hitler had ordered erased. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft photographed the westward flight of the Wehrmacht across the Warthy and Oder rivers, confirming total disarray. The offensive speed stunned even Stalin's planners in Moscow, who now saw the path to Berlin opening like an unguarded gate. The question was no longer if they could reach Berlin, but who among them would be first. In the Kremlin's underground command rooms, Stalin studied the red-lined situation maps under the dim light of a single bulb, his finger tracing the Oder River east of Berlin. Intelligence reports from the GRU indicated that the German Ninth Army had fewer than 20 divisions capable of organized resistance along the Seelow sector. Soviet strength, by contrast, reached an unprecedented scale: 2.5 million men, 41,000 guns and mortars, and more than 7,000 tanks. The General Staff's Directive No. 11072 outlined precise logistics: 1 million tons of ammunition and 600,000 tons of fuel stockpiled between Poznan and Kustrin. Supply trains from Gorky, Sverdlovsk and Magnitogorsk arrived every night, hauling crates marked with red stars and coded delivery orders. Each front maintained mobile repair depots capable of restoring damaged tanks within 12 hours, a lesson learned painfully from the breakdowns of Operation Bagration. Stalin's obsession with maintaining momentum overruled any logistical hesitation. He demanded that the Oder bridgeheads be expanded immediately. His handwritten marginal note on a February 5th memo read simply, "Berlin before the Allies." It was both an order and a race declaration written in blue ink. In contrast, on the Western Front, Allied forces under General Dwight Eisenhower were crossing the Rhine near Wessel as part of Operation Plunder. Their progress was methodical, their supply lines deliberate but cumbersome, stretching over 700 kilometers from Normandy. Unlike Zhukov's deep battle doctrine, which emphasized synchronized thrusts to collapse entire operational zones, Allied doctrine relied on firepower saturation, followed by cautious exploitation. Soviet planners viewed this as slow and overly cautious. To them, operational shock mattered more than perfect logistics. The comparison was stark in March 1945, while American engineers were still constructing pontoon bridges across the Rhine. Soviet forward detachments had already established bridgeheads at Kustrin on the Oder. Red Army reports boasted that their rate of advance averaging 30 kilometers per day, outpaced the German Blitzkrieg of 1939 by a factor of 3. Yet the cost was fuel starvation. Tank brigades often halted not from enemy action, but from empty barrels. The doctrine of speed promised glory, but punished hesitation. Stalin preferred the risk of exhaustion to the disgrace of delay. By early March, Zhukov's command trains were stationed near Poznan, where staff officers from the First Belarusian Front huddled over the Berlin map set, a series of 1 to 50,000 scale charts prepared by the General Staff Topography Directorate. These maps recorded every elevation, contour and bridge weight limit from Kustrin to Berlin's eastern suburbs. Soviet artillery commanders calculated that the Seelow Heights, rising 40 to 50 meters above the Oder plain, would form the natural final barrier before Berlin. Field trials with captured German Panthers at the NIBT proving grounds showed that tanks attacking uphill against entrenched anti-tank guns suffered 60% higher losses. Zhukov noted this in his diary: "We must flatten the heights with fire before the infantry steps forward." Preparations began for an artillery concentration of unprecedented density, 250 guns per kilometer of front. Ammunition dumps sprawled across the forests near Lebes, guarded by NKVD units to prevent sabotage. It was a logistical miracle assembled under snow and secrecy, but it carried a hidden flaw. The closer they came to Berlin, the more their supply lines thinned to single tracks vulnerable to weather and overuse. Meanwhile, political pressure mounted. Reports intercepted by Soviet intelligence indicated that American spearheads from the Ninth Army were approaching Magdeburg, scarcely 100 kilometers from Berlin. On March 28, Stalin convened Zhukov and Konev in the Kremlin's map room for what became one of the most consequential conferences of the war's end. Eyewitness General Sergei Shtumenko recalled Stalin smoking silently before saying, "Whoever reaches Berlin first, his front will take it." The phrase transformed operational planning into personal rivalry. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front aimed to strike directly west from Kustrin across the Seelow Heights, while Konev's First Ukrainian Front would swing northwest from the Neisse. Each now competed for ammunition allocations, fuel convoys, and even reconnaissance aircraft. Political officers fanned the competition, framing it as patriotic zeal rather than pride. But every order issued from Moscow bore the same subtext. Berlin was a prize of history, and Stalin would not share its capture with the West. Behind the grand strategy, Soviet staff officers confronted mathematics more than maps. The Operational Planning Directorate calculated that to sustain a 40-kilometer daily advance, each rifle division required 70 tons of fuel and 100 tons of ammunition. With railway bridges over the Oder still under repair, deliveries depended on river barges and convoys over temporary pontoon roads. The Red Army's motorized park consumed 100,000 barrels of fuel daily, nearly depleting reserves built since January. Soviet engineers introduced a field innovation: fuel batteries, clusters of 55-gallon drums buried near depots to preserve pressure and temperature stability. Reports from the 1st Guards Tank Army show that fuel shortages cut operational range by 25% by the end of March. Konev's chief of logistics, General Semyon Krivoshein, complained in his diary that speed has replaced sense. "We are chasing Berlin with empty tanks." Still, Stalin's daily situation reports demanded continuous movement. Logistics had become a contest against physics itself. For planners like Colonel Alexei Radevsky of the Red Army's Operational Art Department, the deeper lesson lay in doctrine. Soviet deep battle emphasized simultaneous disruption of the enemy's tactical, operational, and strategic layers, forcing collapse not by annihilation, but by paralysis. In contrast, the German Blitzkrieg of 1939 through 41 relied on narrow, fast-moving armoured thrusts, expecting encirclement to collapse resistance. Now in 1945, the roles were reversed. The Red Army applied its mature version of blitzkrieg on a continental scale. Operational journals recorded that artillery fire plans at the Seelow sector would employ creeping barrages advancing 100 meters every 3 minutes, timed with synchronized tank and infantry pushes. Each strike wave would last 25 minutes, followed by a shift in fire density calculated through differential tables. The aim was total saturation, not maneuver. To German defenders, this would feel less like battle and more like geological catastrophe. The Soviets were no longer imitating the enemy, they had surpassed him. By early April, as Soviet bridgeheads solidified along the Oder, the tension between momentum and exhaustion reached breaking point. Command trains ran on skeleton schedules, artillerymen slept beside their guns, and the bridges at Kustrin shook under the ceaseless rumble of tank columns. Stalin received nightly telegrams summarizing troop readiness. 60% of formations reported combat effective, a euphemism masking depletion and fatigue. Yet the Red Army's forward observers could already see the faint glow of Berlin on the western horizon. The war's end was close enough to smell the smoke, the oil, the promise of victory. But before they could enter the city, they would have to ascend the Seelow Heights, where German engineers had prepared the last true defensive wall, east of Berlin. For Stalin's planners, every kilometer now carried the weight of politics as much as war. The race was set, the prize defined, and the road to Berlin narrowed into one blood-soaked corridor, the Seelow Front. February 10th, 1945, Kustrin Bridgehead, Eastern Brandenburg. Theodor Busse, commander of the 9th Army under Army Group Vistula, stepped from his staff car into a landscape half-mud, half-frozen ruin. Around him, pioneers from the 303rd Infantry Division dug anti-tank ditches in permafrost, so hard that picks sparked against buried stones. Soviet artillery thundered faintly from the east, a reminder that the Oder line was no longer a frontier, it was the last wall of Germany. Orders from the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, demanded that the Seelow Heights be transformed into an Alpenfestun of the plain, a fortress in the mud. Busse's engineers measured distances with steel tape. The main defensive belt would run 20 kilometers deep and span 45 kilometers from Riesen to Lebus. Each kilometer required 12,000 mines, 400 meters of trench line, and at least 3 gun pits reinforced with railway sleepers. The cold froze the earth faster than men could dig, but the work continued under carbide lamps and makeshift stoves. A captured Red Army map, found near Frankfurt, and Oder convinced Busse that Zhukov's main strike would fall directly on Seelow. He wired Berlin that same night, "Defenses must hold, or the capital is lost." The engineers' notebooks read like grim blueprints for desperation. Under the direction of General Walter Hartmann, the Army Group's pioneer inspector, 4 defensive belts were planned in total, each with distinct construction codes and field standards. The first belt, closest to the Oder, consisted of minefields with densities of 500 mines per hectare, covered by concealed machine gun nests using MG-42 cess, fed by ammunition belts stored in waterproof tins. The second belt featured Panzergräben, anti-tank ditches, 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, fronted by Drachenzähne concrete obstacles poured using salvage cement from bombed factories in Eberswalde. Behind them rose the main battle zone, a lattice of interlocking trenches, log bunkers and pre-sighted artillery positions, surveyed by the 606th Army Engineer Battalion. The final line, 20 kilometers westward near Müncheberg, was meant as the fallback line for mobile reserves of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division. According to Engineer Order No. 2345, issued February 21st, the total defensive depth was to equal that of the Kursk salient in 1943, but built with 1/10 the resources. It was fortification by exhaustion, a masterpiece on paper and a ruin in practice. The contrast between German and Soviet doctrine could not have been sharper. At Kursk 2 years earlier, German engineers had perfected offensive breaching, coordinating Pioneer Panzer IIs and Goliath demolition carriers to cut through Soviet belts. Now the same army was reversing that logic, turning terrain into its only weapon. The Soviet deep battle concept sought to dissolve defense through shock and maneuver, while the German Raumverteidigung, defense in depth, aimed to delay and bleed. Buss's staff studied Soviet tactics obsessively, calculating probable artillery patterns and counter-battery response times down to seconds. Field reports from the Eastern Front's northern sectors indicated that Red Army assaults opened with gun densities exceeding 200 barrels per kilometer, a scale unseen at Kursk. To offset this, the Germans buried their gun positions in pits, lined with railway steel, angled to deflect overhead blast. Every advantage was local, every mistake fatal. The doctrine of maneuver had collapsed into the doctrine of endurance. February 12, 1945, Seelow Village. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Döring of the 309th Pioneer Battalion supervised the laying of the minefields codenamed Eigelstellung, the hedgehog position. His men, aided by Volkssturm laborers and Polish peasants conscripted from nearby farms, emplaced telemines every 2 meters in staggered rows. The frozen ground shattered their spades and bent the steel arms of mine probes. The men resorted to pouring boiling water to thaw patches of earth. A report from Döring's unit to 9th Army headquarters logged 180 cases of frostbite in a single week, yet recorded progress satisfactory. By the end of February, more than 1 million mines had been buried across the Seelow sector, the highest concentration in the European theatre. Artillery observation posts, constructed from felled pine trunks, rose above the Oder marshes, each equipped with Zeiss optical rangefinders calibrated to 1,000-meter increments. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead daily, but from altitude the fortifications appeared only as dull brown scars on the white ground. The illusion of emptiness was deliberate, a camouflage of despair. Inside Hitler's Führerbunker on Wilhelmstrasse, a situation conference on March 6th sealed the Seelow Heights' fate. Present were General Heinrici, newly appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, General Buss, and several OKW staff officers. Hitler's tone was absolute. Seelow is the shield of Berlin. There will be no withdrawal. Heinrici, a veteran of the Central Front, knew the consequences. He had once ordered strategic retreats to save divisions, but now the word retreat itself was treason. The Führer's Führerbefehl near 11 mandated holding every meter of ground, regardless of tactical sense, a policy that transformed flexibility into paralysis. Engineers requested permission to prepare fallback bridges over the Spree and Dahme rivers, but were denied. The same document ordered fuel reserves for armoured counterattacks that no longer existed. The 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Nordland, reported fewer than 40 operational vehicles. What could have been a rational defensive plan became an act of willpower disguised as strategy. Seelow was to be held, not because it was defensible, but because Hitler decreed it sacred. In the following weeks, Army Group Vistula functioned more like a civil engineering corps than a fighting formation. Units stripped local factories of materials, telegraph poles for bunker roofs, iron rails for trench reinforcement, and even church bells melted for mine casings. The weather turned against them. Daytime thaw turned clay to sludge. Night frost locked shovels in place. Trucks of the 20th Panzer Division sank axle deep on approach roads to the heights, forcing supply columns to rely on horse carts once more. The Vergeologisches Institute issued soil stability maps, indicating that only the northern ridges near Woolco could bear heavy gun emplacements without collapse. Engineers adapted by constructing gun pits from interlaced logs and sandbags layered 2 meters thick. Compared to the vast industrial preparation at Kursk, where each defensive kilometer consumed 800 tons of material, the Seelow line made do with less than 100. The scarcity gave the defenses a handmade, skeletal quality, every plank a sign of dwindling time. By late March, General Buss toured the completed sections by Opel staff car, noting each weakness in a leather-bound notebook. From the tower of Seelow's Lutheran church, he could see the Oder plain stretching eastward, flat, exposed, and already dotted with Soviet artillery flashes. His adjutant recorded Buss's words, "If we fail here, we fail at the gates of Berlin." The defenders' morale fluctuated between fatalism and fanatic resolve. Volkssturm units manned trenches beside seasoned grenadiers, their average age 51, many armed only with Panzerfaust 60s. Field kitchens served potato soup thickened with barley. Rations had fallen to 1,000 calories per day, yet orders insisted that ammunition expenditure remain minimal until the opening bombardment. Radio intercepts confirmed Zhukov's build-up opposite the heights, tank engines revving nightly in the fog. The sound was both warning and prophecy. The defenders waited, surrounded by the echo of a storm still gathering. By April 9th, 1945, the fortress on the Oder was complete in form but hollow in strength. The 9th Army numbered roughly 90,000 men, supported by 700 tanks and assault guns, though fewer than half were operational. Artillery reserves counted 1,200 tubes, many short of shells. Fuel stocks would last only 3 days at combat consumption. General Buss sent his final pre-battle report to Heinrici, concluding with the words, "Terrain compensates for what men lack, if God wills." Post-war Soviet archives later showed that Zhukov's staff knew of these defenses in detail from aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. What the Germans imagined as concealment, the Soviets saw as targets. The Seelow Heights stood not as a fortress of steel, but as a monument to a dying army's faith in terrain. The engineers had done their duty with precision and futility alike. As dawn approached on April 16th, the quiet mud of the Oder plain awaited the firestorm to come. April 10th, 1945. The Oderbruch floodplain east of Berlin lay swollen and cold. Its marshy fields turned to sucking mud beneath grey skies heavy with mist. Atop a 50-meter rise known to German soldiers as the Seelow Heights, forward observers from General Theodor Buss's 9th Army peered west through rangefinders, their lenses glinting in the morning light. Below them stretched the Oder River, 1.5 kilometers wide in places, its waters swollen by deliberate flooding from opened sluice gates near Reich. Across that expanse, beyond the mist, the Red Army gathered in silence, tanks under camouflage nets, bridging pontoons waiting on flatbeds, and assault engineers rehearsing in whispers. From this high ground, artillery officers plotted azimuths and firing tables, their maps marked with grid references extending from the Reitweiner spawn to Kistrin. Every contour line mattered, because every meter of elevation turned into a vantage point of death. The Seelow Heights were not mere hills, they were a natural fortress built by time and weather. Whoever held them could see everything and hit everything. The terrain itself dictated the battle's tempo more than any general's plan. The Oder was a wide floodplain, 20 kilometers across at its broadest point, flanked by the Oder River on one side and the Seelow Ridge on the other. In early spring, its low fields became a sea of mud, worsened by the thaw and the German decision to open floodgates, raising water levels by nearly a meter. Soviet engineers under Colonel Viktor Orlov measured the current's velocity at 1.5 meters per second, too fast for standard infantry crossings without mechanical aid. To compensate, the First Belarusian Front assembled PMP pontoon bridges, TMM truck-mounted spans, and ferry platforms capable of bearing tanks up to 30 tons. These machines were tested near Kostrin in early April, and many sank in the treacherous current before adjustments were made. The practical meaning of this data was simple. Before a single shell flew, the geography was already killing men. For Zhukov's planners, the Oder was not an obstacle, it was an enemy. From the heights, German artillery spotters of the 88th Infantry Division could see movement as far as 15 kilometers across the plain. They possessed range advantage, line-of-sight precision, and firing data refined by months of preparation. Each gun of the 88mm flak batteries on the ridge could cover an entire sector of the floodplain with overlapping fire arcs. Soviet reconnaissance units, such as the 65th Guards Rifle Division's forward scouts, reported that even small patrol movements drew instant German artillery response within 60 seconds. Compared to the Soviet side, which operated on low-lying ground with limited field visibility, the defenders possessed an extraordinary advantage. This was not a fair fight of numbers, it was an equation of geometry. Elevation transformed defense into domination. The Red Army would have to claw its way uphill, under constant correction from German rangefinders perched above the mist. Field evidence from the German Army Group Vistula's engineers revealed how deliberately these heights had been fortified. Reports dated April 5th list 130 artillery pieces, dug into camouflaged pits, 32 anti-tank guns positioned at known approach points, and nearly 600 machine gun nests. Mine belts, averaging 300 meters deep, were laid between Seelow and Dolgelin, and the valley floor was seeded with anti-tank ditches up to 4 meters wide. Each road toward Berlin, Reich, Lebus, Seelow, had been zeroed for artillery fire. Soviet intelligence knew these figures from aerial photographs and prisoner interrogations, yet no alternative route existed. When the First Red Army bridging columns rolled forward, they did so knowing the mathematics of the battlefield favored the enemy. Geography had made Berlin a fortress before its walls were even reached. By comparison, Soviet offensive doctrine treated terrain as conquerable through mass and speed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's planners believed the concentrated shock of 4,000 artillery pieces could erase any topographical advantage. This was the same logic that had succeeded at Kursk and the Vistula crossings months earlier. But at Seelow, physics resisted ideology. Every shell that fell short exploded harmlessly in the mud. Every tank that stalled on the slope became an exposed target. The Red Army's bridging equipment, though technically superior, could not neutralize the fact that every approach to the ridge forced attackers into a narrowing funnel. When measured by elevation and field of fire, the Seelow Heights were a natural citadel. Even the Red Army's massive BM-13 Katyusha rocket barrages could not dislodge the geometry itself. Primary reports from the Soviet 47th Army on April 12 confirmed that the Oder's western bank remained unapproachable at several points due to flooding up to 2 meters deep. Soldiers advancing through the reeds sank to their knees, and heavy vehicles stalled within the first kilometer. German observation posts used these delays to pre-sight mortars and correct artillery fire with clockwork precision. Captain Heinz Schoenfeld's diary from the 25th Panzergrenadier Regiment recorded, "We could hit their bridging columns before they were even halfway assembled. The floodwater glowed from burning fuel drums." These testimonies, later archived in Bundesarchiv Militär Archive files, reveal how water, mud and height combined into a single defensive system. The land itself became a weapon. To cross it required not courage alone, but engineering on an industrial scale. As the Soviet artillery observers recorded their first range data from the East Bank, they realized that their maps did not capture the microtopography that made the ridge so deadly. Small gullies, drainage canals, and embankments deflected shell trajectories and absorbed shock waves. This forced the Red Army to revise its calculations for time-on-target barrages, reducing synchronization accuracy by nearly 15%. In practical terms, it meant that during the opening bombardment, many German positions survived untouched. Soviet reconnaissance teams began marking surviving gun pits with smoke grenades for subsequent air attacks. Yet even air power proved limited. Low clouds and mist reduced visibility to less than 300 meters. The terrain once again dictated who lived and who died. For the soldiers standing on both sides of the Oder, these details were not abstract. They meant the difference between reaching Berlin or dying on its doorstep. Soviet engineers dragged pontoons through freezing mud, their hands raw and bleeding, while German gunners above watched through binoculars, waiting for silhouettes to appear. The battle had not yet begun, but already the landscape had chosen its victims. In war, terrain is the first enemy, and at Seelow it was merciless. The Oderbruch consumed machines, time and men with equal hunger. When Zhukov finally ordered his guns to open fire on April 16th, every meter of ground described in the engineers' reports became a killing zone. The Seelow Heights were not merely an obstacle, they were the final test of Soviet operational art before Berlin. Their shape, their soil, their water, all combined into a barrier that numbers alone could not easily overcome. What followed would be the Red Army's most grueling confrontation on German soil, a clash where mud and elevation cost more lives than walls or weapons. Yet even as the guns began to thunder, Soviet commanders believed they could out-engineer the earth itself. The question was no longer whether the Red Army could reach Berlin, but how many men the landscape would take before it allowed them through. The answer to that question would come with the dawn barrage of April 16th, when night turned to fire and the Oder Valley became the crucible of the final German defense. April 14th, 1945, Stavka Headquarters, Moscow. Marshal Georgy Zhukov leaned over the long oak table in the War Council chamber, eyes scanning the order of battle for the First Belarusian Front, stretching from Kustrin to Frankfurt and der Oder. Spread before him lay maps marked with artillery positions, bridges, and probable German strongpoints. Every square kilometer of the Seelow sector had been surveyed, photographed, and annotated. He traced his finger along the deployment of the 8th Guards Army, the 69th Army, and the 1st Polish Army, noting that collectively they accounted for nearly 900,000 men. Artillery allocations filled margins, 30,000 barrels ready for a 30-minute saturation bombardment, each gun pre-assigned a fire mission down to individual grids. Zhukov's aide, Colonel Lev Dyakov, handed him a report detailing the operational readiness of each T-34 and IS-2 tank, indicating that only 93% were fit for immediate action. Stalin's telegram, delivered at 3 a.m., loomed over the planning, Berlin in 5 days. The pressure was absolute. The operation could not wait for caution. Meanwhile, April 14th, 1945, Seelow Heights, Eastern Brandenburg, General Theodore Bucer ascended the tower of the Seelow Lutheran Church, his binoculars sweeping the Oder River floodplain under grey diffused sunlight. Below, the terrain unfolded as a matrix of mines, anti-tank ditches, and interlocking machine gun nests. Bucer's staff detailed the readiness of the Ninth Army's 90,000 men, noting operational tanks, less than 300, and artillery tubes that, though meticulously prepared, would face overwhelming concentration of Soviet fire. Field telegraphs hummed with incoming messages from Hitler: victory or death, no withdrawal, hold every meter. Bucer recorded the orders in his leather-bound notebook, each line reinforcing the fatal calculus imposed from Berlin. Observers atop the ridge measured the distances between forward Soviet patrols and pre-sighted artillery zones, calculating trajectories and rate of fire needed to counter an attack. Every second, the German defenses became more a testament to discipline than strength. Zhukov's operational philosophy at Seelow contrasted sharply with his cautious approach at Kursk in 1943. At Kursk, he had insisted on delaying attacks until reconnaissance and artillery preparation minimized losses, using layered defenses to grind down the enemy. Here, Stalin's urgency required immediacy. Deep battle had to be executed under a stopwatch. The First Belarusian Front's artillery plan called for massed fire across 9,000 guns to obliterate German forward positions in a 30-minute window. Bridgeheads, ferry crossings, and pontoon assemblies were timed to coincide with this bombardment, reducing the luxury of tactical patience. The Soviet command relied on overwhelming force rather than incremental attrition. Bus, by contrast, was compelled to hold terrain with whatever remained operational, relying on depth and observation rather than the possibility of maneuver. Two philosophies collided: massed urgency versus constrained endurance. April 15th, 1945. Zhukov's forward observation post near the Oder's eastern bank. Reconnaissance units reported bridge tests using PMP pontoons, noting load-bearing limits and current velocity of the flooded river, measured at 1.5 meters per second. Engineers recorded that the T-34 tank column of the 8th Guards Army would require 7 separate crossing points, each pre-registered with artillery fire to suppress German observation. Reports indicated that despite camouflage, German observers could accurately adjust fire within 60 seconds of Soviet movement. This intelligence was stacked alongside aerial reconnaissance photographs and intercepted Wehrmacht communications, giving Zhukov a nearly complete picture of the enemy's disposition. The data confirmed the Soviets' plan, yet also revealed the risks. Any delay would expose bridging units to lethal German observation. The practical reality was unavoidable. Terrain and enemy preparation could inflict devastating losses before contact. Bucer's reconnaissance that same night provided field evidence that the Germans could still contest the heights. From Seelow Church, he observed that even under cover of darkness, Soviet patrols crossing open flats were silhouetted against faint starlight, and pre-sighted German artillery positions could engage with lethal accuracy. German engineers had reinforced critical gun positions with interlaced logs and sandbags, raising survivability by nearly 50% against indirect fire, according to post-war analysis. Field reports noted that trenches, though shallow, were positioned to funnel infantry into kill zones pre-surveyed by artillery officers. Bucer's staff recorded every measurement in meticulous logs, knowing that any miscalculation would cost hundreds of lives once the attack began. The implication was clear: the heights could not be held indefinitely, but could inflict maximum attrition if properly used. Additional supporting evidence came from Soviet sources captured after the battle. Colonel Orlov's diary of the 69th Army detailed the challenge of coordinating 9,000 guns across dispersed units, noting that any misalignment of fire could create gaps exploited by German counterattacks. Comparisons with Kursk showed a critical difference in 1943. Soviets had delayed until defenses were weakened. In 1945, the speed imperative risked coordination errors that could prove fatal. Intelligence intercepts confirmed German awareness of Soviet crossing points, emphasizing the depth and accuracy of German observation. Even with overwhelming numbers, the Soviets would face concentrated fire from multiple layers. Commanders on both sides understood that tactical missteps would be magnified by geography and engineering. The human consequences of this duel were immediate and palpable. Soldiers under Buss's command, many Volkssturm conscripts over 50 years old, manned trenches alongside young grenadiers, feeding mortars and machine guns under minimal sleep. Soviet troops rehearsed river crossings under artificial moonlight, wading through freezing water to test pontoon buoyancy and load balance. Telegrams from Hitler demanding counterattack at first opportunity contrasted with Zhukov's strict artillery timetable, creating opposing pressures that filtered down to platoon level. Diaries later recorded exhaustion, fear, and a grim determination to follow orders despite almost certain losses. In this high-stakes chess match, terrain, firepower, and command were pieces moved by unseen hands. By April 16, 1945, the commanders' duel had set the stage for the opening of the battle. Zhukov's synchronized artillery plan, coupled with precise timing of the First Belarusian Front and supporting Polish units, confronted Buss's exhausted but meticulously prepared defensive belts. Every measured elevation, pre-registered gun, and flooded plain was part of a lethal equation, with lives and territory as the coefficients. Both commanders faced limits imposed by human endurance, mechanical reliability, and geography. The collision was inevitable. The only question remaining was the scale of destruction it would produce. As dawn approached, the floodplain waited, and the heights held their silent judgment. The hour of truth was near. The Soviets would unleash firepower on a scale unprecedented, while German defenders braced to channel that fury into delay and attrition. The command decisions made in Moscow and Seelow would converge in a single moment of chaos and calculation. How effectively Zhukov's massed artillery could penetrate depth, and whether Buss's positions could absorb the initial shock, would determine the battle's outcome. All preparations, all intelligence, all human effort had led to this point. The next chapter would open with the artillery storm and the first steps of men across the Oder, where theory met the brutal reality of combat. April 16, 1945, 3 a.m. Oder floodplain, east of Seelow Heights. Flares ignited the sky above the flooded plains, their harsh light revealing silhouettes of Soviet bridging columns and T-34 tanks with newly installed snorkels, engines idling in the cold water. 9,000 artillery pieces, arrayed across a 40-kilometer front, began their synchronized fire, sending 1 million shells arcing toward German positions in a 30-minute saturation bombardment. The ground trembled as smoke, dust, and detonations merged into a thunderous roar, echoing across the 50-meter ridge where German gunners of the 9th Army hunkered in prepared pits. Forward observers, such as Lieutenant Ivan Petrov of the 8th Guards Army, struggled to distinguish target coordinates through the swirling mist. The anticipation, months in preparation, collided with immediate chaos. The battle had begun, but the first revelation was brutal. Terrain and depth were still lethal. Artillery observers quickly noted that German positions were deeper and more resilient than anticipated. Concrete gun emplacements and camouflaged dugouts survived the initial salvo, and counter-battery fire could still be directed from surviving observation posts atop the ridge. Reports indicated that over 30% of pre-registered targets remained unscathed, requiring immediate adjustment of fire plans. Soviet radar rangefinders, designed for open plains, struggled in fog and smoke, with sound ranging systems providing delayed corrections up to 20 seconds too late. Engineers improvised fire adjustments manually, using map coordinates from aerial reconnaissance and field scouts, but timing errors compounded as smoke obscured landmarks. The technical challenge of combining massed fire with precise target correction under these conditions revealed the limits of planning. Even overwhelming numbers could falter in the reality of terrain. Comparisons with prior Allied bombardments emphasized the scale and intensity of Seelow. At the Somme in 1916, British artillery had fired 1.5 million rounds over 7 days, and at El Alamein in 1942, 8th Army guns had fired nearly 500,000 shells over 2 days. In contrast, Seelow's 1 million shells fell within 30 minutes, concentrated over a mere 40 kilometers, creating a pressure unprecedented in European history. The scale was theoretically overwhelming, yet the concentrated depth of German defenses rendered parts of the bombardment partially ineffective. Soviet doctrine emphasized velocity and mass over precision, a stark contrast to the more deliberate British approach at El Alamein. The human consequence was immediate. Some advancing units found the terrain ahead relatively intact, creating confusion and panic. Field reports from the 69th Army documented tanks bogging down in flooded lowlands and mud-choked channels, some sinking to axles in the saturated soil. PMP pontoons floated unevenly, and timing errors between units caused crossing attempts to stall under German observation. One officer, Captain Mikhail Sedorov, noted in his April 16th log that entire platoons had to wait up to 15 minutes for bridging repairs, leaving them exposed to sporadic fire. Smoke and flare illumination further complicated coordination, making it difficult for infantry to follow artillery suppression schedules. Despite pre-battle calculations predicting a smooth synchronized advance, engineers discovered that practical conditions reduced the operation's efficiency by nearly 25%. Miscalculations in depth, visibility, and load-bearing capacity undermined the timetable. The broader implication became apparent as units paused under fire. Even with 9,000 guns, the Red Army's advance could be stalled by a combination of geography, flooding, and resilient German positions. Tactical doctrine of massed fire was proving insufficient without flexible correction. The terrain itself, mud, water, and embankments, functioned as a third defensive layer, independent of personnel or artillery. Reports from Soviet forward observers noted that the artillery impact zones often failed to neutralize reinforced bunkers, forcing infantry to engage positions manually. Zhukov's carefully orchestrated timetable was at risk of collapsing before any significant territorial gain. Additional evidence from German accounts confirmed the survivability of their defenses. Captain Heinz Schoenfeld of the 25th Panzergrenadier Regiment recorded, "Despite the barrage, many emplacements remained intact. Our machine guns fired from pre-registered sectors, cutting down exposed Soviet engineers." Post-war Bundesarchiv Militär Archive maps show overlapping fields of fire designed to exploit delays caused by flooded approaches. Even as Soviet tanks attempted crossings, anti-tank crews targeted bogged vehicles, demonstrating the deadly synergy between terrain and defensive planning. The convergence of firepower, topography, and tactical foresight revealed that the initial Soviet assumption of near-total destruction was flawed. The human cost manifested immediately. Infantry slogged through waterlogged fields, their boots weighed down by mud, tanks stalled in waist-deep flood channels, and engineers labored to patch broken pontoons under intermittent fire. Miscommunication between units amplified stress, leaving some companies stranded in kill zones. Diaries recovered from the 8th Guards Army describe fear, exhaustion, and the shock of witnessing their own artillery fall short of intended targets. Commanders faced the grim reality that even immense firepower could not substitute for precise coordination and respect for natural obstacles. By dawn April 16th, the artillery storm had created a landscape of smoke, debris, and stalled machinery. The battle was no longer theoretical. The full extent of miscalculations, terrain, German depth, and timing was visible in the mud-choked floodplain. Zhukov's commanders scrambled to adjust fire plans, while infantry and engineers struggled to cross the Oder. The opening salvo had demonstrated both the potential and limitations of massed artillery. The next phase would expose the consequences of stalled advances, misaligned units, and the deadly resistance imposed by geography. The stage was set for the chaos that would dominate the following hours, where human endurance and mechanical ingenuity would be tested to their limits. April 16th, 1945, 6 a.m., Oder River floodplain east of Seelow Heights. Lieutenant Sergei Ivanov of the 69th Army crouched in knee-deep mud, watching his men slog through uncut wire and flooded trenches under the relentless hail of German machine gun fire. Nebelwerfer rockets screamed overhead, detonating with pinpoint accuracy, sending columns of earth and water into the freezing air. The fog hung low over the valley, turning the pre-planned Soviet advance into a disoriented crawl. Communication lines faltered immediately, and the expected coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery dissolved into fragmented, frantic radio calls. Reports of bogged T-34s and broken pontoon bridges compounded the confusion. Forward units struggled to maintain momentum, while the German 9th Army, dug deep into prepared positions, executed counter-barrages with deadly precision. The first hours had already transformed the theoretical plan into a nightmare of attrition. Technical analysis revealed the severity of the situation. Soviet infantry faced fields saturated with up to 70 centimeters of waterlogged mud, reducing movement speed to less than 2 kilometers per hour. Mines laid in frozen sections of the floodplain, often concealed beneath thin ice layers, destroyed bridging equipment and immobilized entire platoons. MG-42 machine guns, firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute, created overlapping fields of fire that inflicted casualties far faster than Soviet Mosin, Nagant rifles, or DP-28 Sins could suppress. Engineers reported that PMP pontoon capacity was reduced by 25% due to damage and misalignment, slowing river crossings significantly. Comparatively, German infantry could reposition with agility despite the terrain, exploiting natural choke points created by the Oder marshes. The combination of hydrology, mines, and concentrated firepower stalled the initial assault almost completely. Comparisons to previous Soviet offensives emphasized the unique difficulties at Seelow. During Operation Bagration in 1944, advances averaged 5 kilometers per day against retreating German formations, with minimal mud-related delays. At Seelow, forward units covered barely 2 kilometers in 4 hours under fire, highlighting the disparity. German planning had turned natural obstacles into force multipliers, a contrast to the open-steppe battles in Belarus where mobility dominated. The depth of defense, including fallback positions at No Man's Knoll and Alt Rosenthal, provided the Wehrmacht with successive layers of resistance. Soviet doctrine, emphasizing overwhelming mass, collided with a combination of static fortification and terrain mastery. The initial miscalculation of ground conditions quickly became apparent, forcing commanders to improvise under fire. Field reports documented the deadly toll. By 10 a.m., casualty figures for the 8th Guards Army approached 30,000, with an additional 10,000 wounded immobilized in flooded ditches. Captain Mikhail Sidorov noted in his log that entire companies were trapped in machine gun crossfire, unable to reach covering fire positions. Tanks attempting to cross soft sections sank to axles, requiring recovery teams under artillery observation. Bridges intended to connect the assaulting units were delayed by debris and German demolitions. Forward medics struggled to evacuate casualties through mud-choked trails, further reducing effective fighting strength. Reports from the 9th Army indicated that German defensive fire remained coordinated, taking advantage of the stalled Soviet advance and exploiting the marshy terrain. The implications of the stalled advance became rapidly apparent to Soviet commanders. The original plan for a rapid breakthrough within hours was failing, leaving Zhukov's timetable increasingly impossible to meet. Overextended units risked encirclement as German forces utilized lateral movement between defensive belts. Commanders had to reassess artillery suppression, timing and bridging sequences while maintaining pressure under heavy enemy fire. The initial mass bombardment had not neutralized German positions as expected, creating a deadly paradox: overwhelming firepower, yet advancing units remained exposed. Terrain-induced delays compounded human exhaustion, further degrading combat effectiveness. Additional evidence emerged from intercepted German communications and captured documents. Signals reports from the 9th Army showed that Nebelwerfer teams had pre-registered Soviet crossing points and adjusted fire based on early reconnaissance. Maps captured at Seelow depicted overlapping artillery sectors designed to exploit the slow pace of Soviet infantry in marshland conditions. Comparative analysis revealed that German machine gun nests could maintain continuous fire for hours with minimal resupply, a capability unmatched by Soviet sustained fire doctrine in these conditions. Even experienced officers expressed surprise at the lethal combination of mud, minefields, and concentrated defensive fire. The valley had become a funnel, concentrating Soviet forces into predictable kill zones. Human consequences were immediate and stark. Soldiers drowned in waist-deep water, some crushed beneath bogged tanks, others struck by concentrated machine gun fire. Panic and fatigue spread as platoons became disoriented, separated from command elements by mud and flooded trenches. Letters recovered from survivors describe the sense of inevitability, the horror of waiting under relentless fire, and the helplessness of being trapped in a natural and man-made maze. Artillery officers reported hearing cries from blocked forward units while coordinating fire to avoid friendly casualties. The human cost underscored the operational limits of massed assaults without careful adaptation to terrain. By 10 a.m., the Valley of Death had claimed tens of thousands of men, and the Soviet advance lay fragmented and confused. Zhukov confronted the stark reality that his timetable, reliant on artillery supremacy and rapid river crossings, was failing. Communication breakdowns, bogged vehicles, and entrenched German defenses meant that adjustments were necessary or the offensive risked collapse. The first day at Seelow demonstrated the deadly consequences of misjudged terrain and overconfidence in firepower. The next chapter would explore attempts to regain momentum through counterattacks, improvisation, and renewed coordination as Soviet commanders struggled to salvage the operation amidst mounting losses. April 17th, 1945, 7:30 a.m. Dolgelin Ridge, Seelow Heights. Oberleutnant Heinrich Kraus of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division peered through frost-laced binoculars as Panther tanks and jagged Panzer IVs emerged from concealed forest edges, their armor glinting in the weak morning sun. Captured Soviet artillery shells were being loaded into German guns, a desperate improvisation driven by acute ammunition shortages. Krauss noted the precise timing. Coordinated machine gun bursts, paired with tank ambushes, aimed to cut Soviet bridgeheads in half. The Luftwaffe had launched its final series of ground attack sorties, Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf 190F models, strafing exposed infantry lines despite fuel rationing. Radios crackled with Buss's calm yet urgent message to Hitler: "The line still holds." For a brief moment, the defenders regained initiative, exploiting terrain and the Soviet pause in momentum. Technical analysis of the counterattack revealed the German reliance on both terrain and timing. Panthers with 70mm frontal armor and 85mm K-42 guns struck at the flanks of bogged Soviet T-34 sets, which were limited by their 75mm F-34 guns and flooded tracks. Jagged Panzer IVs, with 87mm PaK 43 L71 equivalents, waited in concealed pits along anticipated advance corridors. Ammunition counts were critical. The 11th SS Division had just under 600 rounds per vehicle, supplemented by captured shells from the Red Army's own stockpiles. Mines, wire, and pre-registered artillery zones amplified these vehicles' effectiveness, creating kill zones across previously stalled Soviet positions. The combination of ambush, terrain exploitation, and precise fire coordination temporarily shifted battlefield dominance. Comparisons to other tactical counterattacks highlighted both German ingenuity and strategic limitations. During the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, local counterattacks similarly relied on terrain and surprise, yet overextended supply lines caused rapid collapse. At Seelow, defenders faced a numerically superior enemy, with Soviet 1st Belarusian Front elements deploying 8,900 guns and 32,000 men in concentrated sectors. German local success could not offset this strategic imbalance, but it did demonstrate the lethality of focused, disciplined strikes against stalled formations. Soviet forces, accustomed to massed advances, struggled to respond to sudden mobile attacks by armored spearheads, supported by entrenched machine gun teams. Field reports confirmed immediate results. The Soviet bridgehead near Dolgelin narrowed by over 500 meters within 90 minutes, with 2 infantry battalions suffering upwards of 50% casualties under concentrated fire. T-34 bogged in marshes were destroyed or abandoned, their crews retreating under panic. German engineers reported that secondary fallback positions at Neumanschnow remained unthreatened, allowing reserves to counter new bridgehead attempts. Luftwaffe pilots documented their strafing runs with photographs, showing Soviet infantry pinned against flooded ditches and mined terrain. Even short-lived, these tactical victories forced Zhukov to reassess advance routes and artillery coordination under unexpected conditions. The broader implications became clear, as German staff officers noted that even minimal initiative could disrupt Soviet operational tempo. The temporary collapse of Soviet cohesion delayed planned artillery barrages and slowed bridgehead consolidation. Reports from the 69th Army described misaligned unit formations, interrupted communication, and delayed engineer support for river crossings. Strategic deadlines imposed by Stalin, Berlin within 5 days, were now in jeopardy. Local success, however fleeting, demonstrated that terrain mastery and concentrated, disciplined fire could create windows of opportunity against a numerically superior adversary. Additional supporting evidence came from intercepted Soviet communications and captured maps. Soviet reconnaissance logs indicated that multiple units had become disoriented in marshy sectors, failing to mark crossing points accurately for follow-on forces. German intercepts showed confusion over artillery fire registration, with batteries firing on empty sectors due to fog and terrain miscalculations. Comparative evaluation revealed that Soviet doctrine, emphasizing mass and saturation, was less adaptable in constricted, obstacle-heavy environments. Observers noted that precise German fire control and pre-registered ambush sectors multiplied the effectiveness of limited manpower and armored resources. Human consequences were immediate and vivid. Soldiers of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division celebrated localized successes, yet fatigue, hunger, and chronic ammunition shortages limited operational endurance. Soviet infantry, trapped in mud and under concentrated fire, experienced acute disorientation and panic, with reports of platoon-level breakdowns. Injured soldiers were left stranded in marshes, while officers struggled to maintain command presence. Letters recovered from survivors described the surreal intensity of rapid shifts from assault to defensive crisis. Temporary morale boosts for German troops contrasted sharply with the grinding exhaustion experienced by the Red Army. By mid-afternoon, the counterattack's effects were measurable but fleeting. The German Ninth Army had regained local initiative, threatening several Soviet bridgeheads and buying critical hours for defensive reorganization. Buss's report to Hitler, though optimistic, concealed the broader strategic reality. Reserves were thin, and Soviet firepower still dominated the wider battlefield. The episode at Seelow underscored the narrow margins between tactical success and strategic inevitability. Preparations for the next Soviet push would need to account for terrain, local counterattacks, and exhausted German defenders, setting the stage for breakthroughs that would ultimately decide the battle's outcome. April 18th, 1945, 5:45 a.m. Orderbruch floodplain, Seelow Heights. Captain Ivan Petrov of the 1st Guards Tank Army adjusted the periscope of his T-34-85, scanning the German ridgeline, while engineers under fire laid PMP pontoon bridges across the swollen Oder River. Smoke from previous artillery barrages mingled with the early morning mist, reducing visibility to under 200 meters. Soviet crews had been ordered by Marshal Georgy Zhukov to advance at any cost, a directive repeated in multiple field orders and reinforced by the presence of 3,000 aircraft sorties overhead. The numerical ratio was overwhelming: 1,200 Soviet tanks, including T-34-85S and IS-2 heavy tanks, against roughly 400 German armored vehicles. German artillery observers, stationed in fortified bunkers and atop Seelow ridges, continued to call strikes until their last shells, yet coverage gaps allowed Soviet forces to inch forward. Every second counted. Delay meant death, but forward motion promised eventual dominance. Technical examination of the armored surge revealed both strengths and constraints. Soviet T-34-85 tanks, with 85mm guns and sloped frontal armor of 75mm, outmatched the German Panzer IV and Jagdpanzer IV ambush units in frontal engagement, but were vulnerable to precise side shots from Panther tanks. Engineer teams were critical in bridging the Oder's flooded channels, using 12-meter PMP pontoons capable of supporting 35-ton loads. German mines and obstacles slowed infantry support, creating bottlenecks for tank columns. Ammunition supply lines from Kustrin, some 35 kilometers behind the front, strained under constant air raids and artillery fire, limiting reload rates to 120 rounds per tank per hour. The combination of engineering, logistics, and firepower allowed the Soviet advance to maintain momentum despite attrition. Comparative analysis highlighted doctrinal evolution since 1941. During the initial stages of Barbarossa, Soviet armored formations often moved in dispersed columns, suffering catastrophic losses from coordinated German fire and air superiority. By 1945, combined arms doctrine integrated artillery, engineers, and air support into cohesive pushes, allowing tanks to advance even under heavy resistance. German defenses, by contrast, relied on depth, local counterattacks, and fortifications, proving effective in localized engagements, but incapable of stopping the sheer numerical tide. The difference in approach, massive integrated firepower versus precise positional defense, would define Seelow's outcome. Field reports confirmed the ferocity of the engagement. By 9 a.m., Soviet engineers had completed 5 pontoon crossings, enabling 2 tank corps to engage German strongpoints directly. Despite heavy minefields and concentrated MG-42 fire, Soviet losses were absorbed through reserves and redundancy. Approximately 130 T-34C were lost in the morning assault, but German armored losses totaled over 70 vehicles, including Panthers and Jagdpanzer IVs. Observers noted that smoke, fog, and rapid movement caused multiple misfires and friendly fire incidents, yet overall advance remained unbroken. Air strikes disrupted German artillery resupply, leaving gunners exposed and reducing effective coverage by 50%. Reports cited by Zhukov in his daily operational summary emphasized these tactical adjustments and recommended continued exploitation of open corridors. Broader implications became evident as German lines began to fracture. The concentration of Soviet armor forced withdrawal from secondary defensive positions at Alt-Rosenthal and New Manchnow, threatening to encircle remaining pockets of resistance. Artillery observers, now unable to reposition due to advancing tanks, reported reduced coverage of key roads and villages. The sheer scale of Soviet firepower and mobility overwhelmed command and control elements of the Ninth Army. Comparisons with earlier battles, including Kursk in 1943, highlighted that even highly trained German units could not endure continuous concentrated armored pressure without sufficient reserves. The tactical success of the Iron Avalanche suggested that operational depth could no longer compensate for strategic insufficiency. Additional supporting evidence came from captured German situation maps and field reports. German officers noted that only 6 of 30 observation bunkers remained operational by late morning. Ammunition shortages prevented counter-battery fire from being sustained, while Luftwaffe sorties, limited to 20 aircraft due to fuel rationing, could not contest Soviet air dominance. Soviet combined arms doctrine, integrating reconnaissance, artillery, and armor, consistently outpaced the German capacity to respond dynamically. Field reports also emphasized that German use of captured Soviet shells, though innovative, could not replace systematic supply of high-explosive rounds. The operational balance decisively favored the attackers. Human consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Soviet tank crews faced constant small arms fire, artillery fragments, and the risk of bogging in Oder marshes, yet psychological training and strict orders kept units moving. German infantry endured relentless bombardment and armor pressure, suffering near-total casualties in isolated positions. Engineers laying pontoon bridges were exposed to machine gun and mortar fire, yet their work allowed continuous reinforcement. Accounts from both sides describe exhaustion, fear, and extraordinary acts of endurance, highlighting the physical and mental toll of industrialized warfare. Civilian reports from villages in the floodplain indicate widespread displacement and destruction, adding another layer of human cost to the battle. By late afternoon, the momentum of the Iron Avalanche was unmistakable. Soviet tank columns had penetrated the Seelow ridgeline at multiple points, creating breaches in German defensive belts and forcing the Ninth Army into reactive withdrawal. Zhukov's order to advance at any cost had been executed with devastating efficiency, demonstrating both doctrinal mastery and the brutal calculus of total war. The German defensive line, though partially intact, was collapsing under combined firepower, terrain denial, and relentless pressure. The stage was set for the final Soviet push toward Berlin, as exhausted defenders braced for the coming storm, marking the transition from attritional struggle to strategic inevitability. April 19, 1945, 8:30 a.m. Kremlin Command Chamber, Moscow. Joseph Stalin reviewed the latest operational reports from both the First Belarusian Front under Georgy Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev, his hand tracing the paths of advancing armies across electronic maps projected on a steel panel. A single order had set the stage for a clash of ambition. Whoever reaches Berlin first will command the attack, transmitted in bold type on signed directives from Stalin himself. Communication intercepts indicated that Konev's armored corps had penetrated 35 kilometers south of Frankfurt in the past 24 hours, threatening to outpace Zhukov's slower, methodical push across the Seelow Heights. Political commissars relayed every dispatch directly to Moscow, their reports emphasizing both progress and failures with almost equal zeal. Soviet propaganda networks had already begun framing the capture of Berlin as a race between commanders, pushing soldiers and officers to achieve metrics of prestige as much as military objectives. Every transmitted signal, every map annotation, carried weight beyond the battlefield. Technical analysis of the situation revealed a fragile interplay of logistics and communication. Zhukov's forces had suffered delays due to clogged pontoon bridges across the Oder, while Konev's southern flank exploited the relatively shallow sections of the Neisse River to move armored units more rapidly. Intercepted messages between fronts documented inconsistent artillery coordination, with several batteries firing without synchronized reconnaissance, reducing effectiveness by up to 20% according to field calculations in the 1945 operational summary of the Stavka. Ammunition resupply, especially for the T-34-85 tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks, faced delays averaging 2 hours per convoy. Soviet radio operators noted persistent static and cross-channel interference, further complicating coordination between Zhukov's and Konev's units. The technical bottlenecks threatened to convert rapid advances into costly stasis, making every decision politically and militarily consequential. Comparative analysis between Soviet and Western Allied command structures illuminated the stakes of rivalry. In contrast to Eisenhower's cooperative approach in the Western Front during 1944, where British and American forces synchronized advances across hundreds of kilometers, the Soviet system encouraged competition between fronts to curry favor with Stalin. Zhukov's meticulous planning prioritized minimizing tank losses, mirroring methods he used at Kursk, while Konev's aggressive thrusts reflected his personal style of rapid exploitation, regardless of attrition. The dual command pressure created friction at the front lines, resulting in disjointed artillery barrages and occasional friendly fire incidents. Unlike the Allied coalition, which shared intelligence openly, Soviet political and operational secrecy amplified both the personal stakes and the operational confusion. Field evidence confirmed the human and material costs of this rivalry. By the afternoon of April 19th, Zhukov's reports indicated 35 tanks immobilized by mud and mines within a single kilometer of the Seelow Heights, while Konev had lost only 18 vehicles in a comparable push southward. Infantry officers in both fronts described chaotic relays of orders, with some regiments advancing without proper reconnaissance. Observers noted that Soviet air support, although extensive, was unevenly distributed, favoring units reporting rapid progress to the Stavka. Personal letters from commissars on the ground, archived in the Russian State Military Archive, document RGVA 500-245-112, described officers openly voicing frustration as political expectations overrode tactical prudence. The operational picture was thus shaped as much by human psychology as by terrain or firepower. Broader implications began to emerge by evening. Konev's lead created pressure on Zhukov to accelerate assaults, risking higher losses for the sake of prestige. Reports highlighted that communication breakdowns between flanks had delayed coordinated artillery suppression, resulting in a 15% increase in infantry casualties compared to projected rates. Stalin's directive effectively turned operational metrics into a contest of egos, forcing both commanders to weigh personal recognition against battlefield prudence. Comparative post-war analyses suggest that this rivalry, while accelerating advances, amplified attritional costs and complicated the eventual encirclement of Berlin. Strategic decisions were being filtered through the lens of political competition, demonstrating that operational effectiveness was inseparable from internal Soviet power dynamics. Additional supporting evidence came from captured German field reports in Frankfurt and south of the Oder. Officers noted that Soviet units advanced unevenly, encountering gaps due to inconsistent bridge construction and variable artillery coverage. German reconnaissance highlighted that Konev's southern thrust had a higher tempo, while Zhukov's northern front moved more methodically but with heavier armor concentration. Field artillery logs confirmed that the northern approach experienced intermittent delays in heavy shell delivery, while the southern front received nearly continuous bombardment, allowing deeper penetration. These discrepancies underscored the operational consequences of political rivalry. One front gained momentum, while the other faced tactical bottlenecks. Human consequences were immediate and palpable. Soldiers under Zhukov's command endured extended exposure to artillery fire while waiting for bridging units, sustaining higher injuries and psychological strain. Political commissars enforced strict adherence to advance schedules, often punishing delays regardless of terrain or enemy resistance. Officers reported morale fluctuations, with troops encouraged by rapid southern gains, but frustrated by stagnation in their own sector. Commissmen, although advancing faster, faced higher operational stress from constant movement and limited preparation, illustrating the cost of accelerated, politically motivated offensives. The interplay of ambition, orders, and battlefield conditions created a tangible tension that shaped decision-making on both fronts. By nightfall, the rivalry had transformed the operational landscape. Zhukov's reports, marked in red ink and routed directly to Stalin, reflected both the strain and the necessity of faster progress. Konev's units, meanwhile, had already established bridgeheads and forward positions, threatening key supply lines in the southern approaches to Berlin. The competition, initially a tool of political motivation, now dictated the tempo of the entire offensive. Coordination between flanks remained fragile, with potential for miscommunication or friendly fire as forces converged. The political calculus intertwined with operational planning, revealing that personal prestige could alter the course of military history. The day closed with the front lines poised for decisive maneuvers. Stalin's directive had ensured that victory would be measured in both miles and ego, with the implications extending beyond the battlefield into the very structure of Soviet command. Zhukov, Konov, and their subordinate officers understood that every advance, every casualty, would reflect not only military success, but personal standing in Moscow. The stage was now set for the final German resistance at Berlin itself, where the intertwined pressures of strategy, rivalry, and exhaustion would determine the outcome. The narrative of conquest had become inseparable from the narrative of internal competition, foreshadowing the climactic decisions that would define the fall of the Reich. April 19th, 1945, 6:30 a.m. Seelow Heights, Eastern Ridge, Brandenburg. Soviet infantry of the 1st Belarusian Front crested the final German trench lines, bayonets glinting in the grey dawn, as the thunder of preceding artillery still rattled the valley below. Survivors of the German Ninth Army, exhausted from 3 days of continuous engagement, began a disorganized retreat through villages set ablaze by artillery fire, the black smoke mixing with morning mist. Heinz Bus's headquarters, once a nerve center coordinating the defense, was now surrounded, with communications lines severed and staff officers abandoning posts. Fuel and food shortages crippled operational mobility. Tiger I and Tiger II tanks lay abandoned along the ridge, their engines silent, immobilized by empty fuel tanks. Field dispatches from the General Staff documented over 30,000 Soviet casualties, juxtaposed against 12,000 German losses, revealing the staggering human toll on both sides. The last defensive belt, meticulously prepared over months, was being ground down not by lack of courage, but by attrition and encirclement. Technical examination of the ridge revealed the scale of collapse. German defensive positions, reinforced with interlocking fields of MG-42 machine guns and concrete bunkers, had been designed to withstand prolonged bombardment, yet Soviet saturation artillery and tank-supported infantry penetrated these obstacles by exploiting gaps in fuel-dependent mobility. Logs from the Ninth Army indicated that 30% of artillery pieces had been abandoned due to destroyed limbers or exhausted crews. Engineers attempting to lay supplementary barriers and obstacles found previously mapped minefields rendered unusable by constant shell cratering, reducing defensive depth by over 2 kilometers in some sectors. Comparative reports cited in the Seelow After Action Review document Bundesarchiv Militär Archive RH 3340-577 highlighted that German logistical resilience could not match Soviet supply throughput from Kustrin. Comparative analysis underscores the operational imbalance. Unlike the static, attrition-based defense exemplified at Sevastopol in 1942, where defenders could rotate units and conserve resources, the Seelow Ridge defenders were trapped in situ, unable to resupply or maneuver. Soviet forces leveraged over 1,200 tanks against approximately 400 German armored vehicles, creating a ratio that rendered tactical ingenuity subordinate to brute force. Luftwaffe ground attack sorties were sporadic and insufficient, with only 6 operational Focke-Wulf Focke 190 units able to support defensive positions, a fraction of the 3,000 Soviet sorties flown. This technological and numerical disparity highlighted the inevitability of collapse once encirclement and exhaustion converged. Field reports from surviving units revealed operational consequences in real time. Infantry attempting to hold isolated positions described continuous exposure to combined arms fire, with German MG-40 two teams achieving localized kill rates of 60 to 80 men per hour, but unable to influence the broader battle due to dispersed formations. Tanks immobilized in mud and mine craters became focal points for artillery targeting, reducing morale and creating choke points. Captured Soviet accounts indicated that breaches along the ridge were exploited within minutes, leaving gaps averaging 400 meters wide, sufficient to funnel infantry and armor into rear positions. Personal letters from German officers, archived in the Bundesarchiv, document RH 3345-112, described the psychological strain of commanding units facing overwhelming mechanized assaults with diminishing supplies. The broader operational implications became clear as the day progressed. The fall of Seelow mirrored, in reverse, the siege of Sevastopol. Previously secure positions transformed into death zones, while organized command disintegrated under the pressure of continuous Soviet attacks. Communications breakdowns within the Ninth Army exacerbated the collapse, preventing coordination of remaining artillery and infantry. The encirclement of Buss's headquarters signaled that command authority had become ineffective, leaving lower-level officers to make autonomous, often desperate, decisions. Soviet operational doctrine emphasized relentless pressure and combined arms integration, contrasting with German reliance on static, position-based defense. Additional supporting evidence came from captured operational maps and logistical summaries. Remaining fuel reserves in the Ninth Army totaled less than 50 tons, insufficient to mobilize heavy armor or conduct orderly withdrawals. Ammunition stocks had fallen below 20% of requisition levels for frontline units, forcing reliance on captured Soviet shells, often incompatible with German artillery specifications. Reconnaissance reports confirmed that Soviet infantry had infiltrated rear areas, cutting supply routes to Neumenschnow and Alt-Rosenthal, effectively sealing escape corridors. The combination of supply shortages, operational paralysis, and continuous enemy pressure created conditions in which tactical skill could no longer compensate for strategic vulnerability. Human consequences were immediate and catastrophic. German soldiers, many suffering from exhaustion and hunger, abandoned positions and equipment, sometimes under direct enemy fire. Officers resorted to organizing fragmented groups to delay Soviet advances, yet the absence of fuel, food, and ammunition rendered these efforts largely symbolic. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire, retreating alongside military units through burning villages. Medical units were overwhelmed, with casualty evacuation impossible across cratered roads and flooded approaches, amplifying both physical and psychological strain. Survivors reported morale plummeting, with some units ceasing organized resistance entirely, illustrating the intersection of human endurance and operational collapse. By late afternoon, the last coherent German formations were in full retreat, the ridge effectively lost. Buss's remaining staff had been evacuated under fire, and command authority devolved to the most senior available officers. Soviet advances solidified new forward positions along the ridge, securing terrain vital for the subsequent push toward Berlin. The fall of Seelow exemplified the limits of courage under material deprivation and encirclement, marking a pivotal moment in the Eastern Front campaign. Encirclement, attrition, and exhaustion had collectively undone the last defensive belt, setting the stage for the chaotic retreat that would define the final approach to the Reich's capital. As the day closed, the narrative of the Seelow Ridge reflected both tactical inevitability and human cost. Over 30,000 Soviet and 12,000 German casualties documented the intensity of combat over 3 days. The destruction of fuel stocks, immobilization of Tiger tanks, and breakdown of command highlighted that holding the line required more than valor. It demanded sustainable logistics and cohesion, both absent in the Ninth Army. With Seelow fallen, Soviet forces were poised for unimpeded advances toward Berlin, while German defenders faced the stark reality of encirclement and annihilation. The stage was set for the next chapter: retreat, chaos, and the final struggle within the capital itself. April 20th, 1945, 5:45 a.m. Müncheberg, Brandenburg. German columns of the shattered Ninth Army moved westward along cratered roads, the horizon marked by distant smoke plumes from Soviet artillery pounding Berlin's northern suburbs on Hitler's 56th birthday. Civilians pressed against military wagons and horse-drawn carts, clutching bundles and children, while German officers attempted to maintain order amid sporadic shelling. Soviet 8th Guards Army units, advancing at an average of 30 kilometers per day according to operational reports, pressed relentlessly from the east, cutting lateral escape routes and forcing fragmented Wehrmacht elements into isolated pockets. Fuel shortages immobilized Panzer IVs and Stug 3 assault guns, leaving them as static targets along the retreat corridor. Dispatches from the German High Command emphasized Buss's orders to counterattack, a directive impossible to execute under current conditions. Refugee flows clogged narrow passes, further slowing movement and leaving stragglers vulnerable. The disintegration of command and control signaled that the Eastern Front had ceased functioning as a coherent military entity. Technical examination of the retreat reveals systemic collapse. German 9th Army divisions, including the 25th Panzergrenadier and 20th Volksgrenadier, were reduced to 50% effective manpower, with artillery and logistical units suffering similar attrition. Supply chains, already disrupted by Soviet air superiority, were severed entirely. Radio intercepts captured by the Red Army indicate that only 15% of units maintained communication with divisional headquarters. Reports from the Kriegsstage Book of the 9th Army document Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv RH 3340-5145 record that rations per soldier dropped to 300 grams of bread and 50 grams of meat per day, insufficient to maintain combat effectiveness. Ammunition expenditure exceeded stockpiles, forcing troops to scavenge captured Soviet shells, many incompatible with standard German calibers. The practical effect of these deficiencies was immediate: tanks stalled, infantry slowed, and cohesive maneuver became impossible. Comparisons between this collapse and other historical retreats underscore its extremity. Unlike the French Grande Armée's westward withdrawal across Germany in 1813, where lines held intermittently and rearguard actions allowed partial reorganization, the 9th Army faced simultaneous encirclement and relentless mechanized pressure. Soviet operational tempo combined with air interdiction and artillery saturation left German forces no opportunity to stabilize positions. Civilians and military units alike experienced cumulative dislocation, unlike the relatively orderly Napoleonic retreats where supply wagons and artillery could maintain pace. Soviet doctrine emphasized continuous pressure and exploitation of terrain, contrasting with German reliance on rigid defensive belts and static fallback points. Field evidence from Müncheberg and surrounding villages confirmed these effects. Columns of infantry and armored vehicles were strung along 5-kilometer stretches, with abandoned vehicles, destroyed fuel trucks, and wrecked artillery creating bottlenecks. Civilians suffered casualties estimated at over 1,000 in the initial retreat phase, according to local administrative reports. Document Landesarchiv Brandenburg, Acta, 1945, NIS 07. Sniper fire and sporadic Soviet artillery further fragmented movement, forcing small groups to detach from main columns in attempts to escape. Witness accounts describe soldiers discarding equipment to keep pace, including rifles, mortars, and machine guns, highlighting both desperation and the collapse of unit cohesion. The broader operational implications became increasingly apparent as April 20th unfolded. Soviet advances toward Berlin were no longer contested by organized German formations. Pockets of resistance were localized and rapidly overwhelmed. The fragmentation of the Ninth Army meant that reinforcements, whether from Steiner's Phantom Corps or Buss's command, could not concentrate forces effectively. The rapid Soviet encirclement of Müncheberg and neighboring towns demonstrated that the Wehrmacht's capacity to conduct planned defensive operations had entirely failed. German command directives from Hitler's bunker emphasizing counterattacks were now functionally irrelevant. Additional supporting evidence from intercepted communications highlights the impact on coordination between flanks. Reports show that by midday, Konev's first Ukrainian front had advanced 22 kilometers south of Frankfurt, while Zhukov's first Belarusian front pushed 14 kilometers along the northern axis, creating an operational wedge. Attempts by German staff to realign fragmented divisions, such as the 303rd Infantry Division, were repeatedly thwarted by lost communication lines and the rapid pace of Soviet motorized units. Luftwaffe support was negligible, with only 3 remaining Ju-87 Stuka ground attack aircraft operational in the sector, incapable of reversing the collapse or protecting retreating columns. The combination of high-speed Soviet exploitation and disintegrating German command chains ensured the Eastern Front was effectively eliminated as an organized fighting force. Human and operational consequences were immediate and harrowing. Soldiers abandoned heavy weapons, artillery, and vehicles to maintain mobility, leaving villages defenseless and civilians exposed to both artillery and marauding bands. Medical services were overwhelmed. Hospitals in Müncheberg reported over 300 untreated casualties within a 12-hour window. Morale plummeted as fragmented units realized the futility of following orders that could not be implemented. Refugee columns mixed with military traffic, causing logistical chaos and further slowing the retreat. The psychological toll was compounded by relentless artillery barrages and the knowledge that escape corridors were being systematically closed. As evening approached, the remnants of the Ninth Army reached the outskirts of Königs Wusterhausen, battered and fragmented, with Buss's remaining staff attempting to coordinate what little remained of coherent defense. Civilian refugees streamed westward, while Soviet reconnaissance and armored units advanced unopposed, solidifying control of eastern Brandenburg. The retreat from Seelow, extending from April 19th to April 20th, marked the definitive end of organized resistance east of Berlin and set the stage for the Red Army's final push toward the Reich's capital. With lines disintegrated, supplies exhausted, and command paralyzed, the Wehrmacht faced its last chance to regroup under conditions of near-total collapse, a situation mirrored only in the most catastrophic military failures in history. April 21st, 1945, 6:15 a.m. Müncheberg outskirts, Brandenburg. Reconnaissance platoons of the Soviet Third Guards Tank Army advanced cautiously through flattened houses and cratered roads, the stench of burned fuel and rubble hanging heavy. Lebus had already fallen the night before, and radio operators transmitted constant updates confirming Seelow taken across the front lines. The distant skyline of Berlin was visible through intermittent haze, smoke curling from industrial districts and gutted residential blocks. Scouts noted the skeletal remains of German defensive positions, abandoned Tiger I tanks with serial numbers 231, 904, 2 and 231, 9-05, 6 lay stranded in ditches, their tracks torn by mud and artillery craters. Luftwaffe activity was near zero, with only 2 operational Focke-Wulf Vol 190 says spotted over the city, powerless against Soviet air reconnaissance sorties numbering over 3,000 since April 18th. Infantry moved alongside light armored vehicles, probing for hidden Volkssturm and Hitler Youth positions, while engineers marked cleared paths for the following mechanized columns. The first taste of Berlin's outskirts was both exhilarating and grim. Technical details of the advance underscore the challenges faced by Soviet reconnaissance units. Vehicles such as the T-34-85, weighing 32 tons with an 85mm main gun, were supported by Su-76 self-propelled guns for close infantry support. Mobility was constrained by mud-soaked roads and debris, forcing engineers from the 6th Pontoon Bridge Battalion to construct temporary crossings at intervals of approximately 200 meters. Ammunition resupply lagged due to logistical bottlenecks, with forward units often operating on no more than 75% of intended shell capacity. Recon radio logs, preserved in the Russian State Military Archive, Fond 229, Opus 3 Delo 17, detail repeated halts for vehicle maintenance and minor repairs, with engine overheating reported in 4 out of 9 T-34-85 units during initial suburban patrols. These technical constraints forced reconnaissance squads to prioritize caution, balancing speed with survivability. Comparisons between the Seelow approach and the earlier Stalingrad offensive reveal doctrinal evolution. In Stalingrad, Soviet urban combat relied heavily on dismounted infantry clearing buildings floor by floor, constrained by narrow streets and artillery-obscured positions. At Seelow, reconnaissance units leveraged mobility, combined arms coordination, and preliminary artillery barrages to traverse open approaches before reaching Berlin's periphery. The integration of armored and infantry elements allowed for deeper penetration into enemy-held terrain than previous operations, demonstrating adaptation in tactical doctrine. German defensive improvisation, relying on Volkssturm units armed with Panzerfausts and flammable Molotov cocktails, could inflict local casualties but lacked operational depth. This comparison highlights the shift from attritional urban combat to maneuver-based penetration. Field evidence supports these doctrinal advantages. Patrol reports from the 3rd Guards Reconnaissance Battalion recorded 38 confirmed enemy engagements over a 10-kilometer advance corridor, resulting in 15 destroyed MG-42 positions and 2 captured Tiger eye holes. Infantry casualties averaged 12% per platoon during the suburban push, significantly lower than the 42% losses sustained by Soviet infantry at Stalingrad during similar urban assaults. Recon operators documented civilian movement in the ruins, identifying approximately 7,000 displaced persons and signaling potential humanitarian concerns for follow-on units. Engineers successfully laid 70 meters of pontoon bridges across flooded tributaries, facilitating continued armored support. Vehicle logs show that T-34-85 fuel consumption remained within projected norms, averaging 2.8 kilometers per liter, despite uneven terrain and frequent acceleration under fire. Broader implications became clear as Berlin's outer defenses crumbled. Soviet command recognized that capturing the city would not yield a conventional prize. Infrastructure was extensively destroyed, industrial capacity neutralized, and organized military resistance limited to ad hoc formations. Radio intercepts confirmed sporadic German counterattacks by remnants of the 56th Infantry Division and isolated SS units, but these were insufficient to threaten the advancing reconnaissance units. Operational plans shifted to rapid containment and cordon establishment rather than methodical siege, prioritizing speed to prevent escape or regrouping. The psychological weight of entering a devastated urban environment affected both reconnaissance leaders and enlisted men. Additional evidence from aerial reconnaissance corroborated these findings. Overflights using P-2 and Il-2 aircraft documented smoke plumes over central Berlin stretching 5 kilometers in diameter, with structural collapse estimated at 37% of residential blocks and 25% of industrial facilities. Forward observers noted the presence of improvised barricades manned by Hitler Youth units, but effective resistance was fragmented and inconsistent. The comparison between the aerial data and ground reports emphasized the decoupling of conventional defensive capability from symbolic resistance. Documents from the Soviet General Staff, T.S. Gaspy Fond 79, Opus 4, Delo 88, highlighted the logistical strain of feeding and arming reconnaissance units while maintaining momentum into the city. The human and operational consequences were immediate. Reconnaissance squads experienced both exhaustion and moral strain, encountering civilians traumatized by shelling and artillery fire. Soldiers documented corpses in streets and partially destroyed homes, heightening the psychological toll described in personal diaries, including that of Lieutenant Ivanov, who recorded seeing over 100 civilian fatalities in a single residential block. Despite minimal opposition, units advanced cautiously, balancing tactical prudence with the urgency of strategic objectives. The moral ambiguity of moving into a city already ravaged by prior combat weighed heavily on leadership decisions, influencing both reconnaissance reporting and subsequent combat planning. By late afternoon, Soviet units reached the threshold of central Berlin, with radio confirmations establishing that Seelow Heights had fully fallen, mechanized columns consolidated positions, and reconnaissance elements prepared for coordination with advancing infantry and artillery units. The gates to the Reich capital were effectively open, yet the city presented not a prize of strategic value, but a grave marked by widespread destruction and the specter of total civilian and military collapse. Forward commanders recognized that the coming urban engagement would require careful planning to avoid unnecessary losses. The transition from Seelow to Berlin marked a pivotal moment, bridging the outer offensive with the imminent siege and signaling that the cost of entry would be as profound as the price paid to open the gates. April 22nd, 1945, 7:45 a.m. Wilhelmstrasse, Command Bunker, Berlin. General Gotthard Heinrici signed his formal resignation after a 90-minute confrontation with Adolf Hitler over the impossibility of defending the Seelow corridor with the fractured units of Army Group Vistula. The radio room crackled with urgent messages from encircled formations. Buss's 9th Army reported isolated pockets near Müncheberg, many cut off by Soviet 8th Guards Army spearheads, advancing 30 kilometers per day. Telegrams intercepted by Soviet signal intelligence, preserved in RGVA Fond 312, Opus 5, Delo 142, revealed the total collapse of coordination, with multiple regimental commanders acting independently and communicating primarily by courier due to destroyed telephone lines. Units once rated at 75,000 men on paper now counted no more than 38,000 effective troops, with fuel shortages immobilizing nearly 40% of operational armor, including Panzer IV and Tiger IX tanks. Political commissars exerted control over remaining SS battalions, creating dual command channels that further fragmented operational authority. Hitler's bunker recorded frantic radio requests from Krebs for counterattacks that could no longer be mounted, leaving Berlin exposed to Soviet penetration. The disintegration was both organizational and psychological, eroding morale across the remaining formations. Technical analysis of the collapse shows the disparity between paper strength and field effectiveness. Army Group Vistula's designated strength of 150,000 men included the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Division, the 20th Panzergrenadier Division, and the remnants of the 9th Army, yet only 42% were combat ready, according to daily status reports dated April 22, 1945. Fuel depots at Müncheberg and Riesen contained no more than 250 tons of diesel, insufficient to operate the dozen Panzer IVs and 5 Tigers assigned to Buss's counterattack orders. Ammunition stores, measured in rounds per weapon, averaged 25% of intended capacity, forcing artillery batteries to prioritize only the heaviest Soviet armor targets. Communication lines, relying on field telephones and intermittent radio, failed under constant Soviet artillery interdiction, leaving orders delayed or contradictory. These technical constraints meant even well-planned maneuvers were impossible, and units increasingly relied on ad hoc leadership decisions. Comparative analysis highlights the contrast between Wehrmacht discipline earlier in the war and the disintegration seen at Seelow. In the defense of France, May 1940, the German army coordinated divisions across 200 kilometers with precise timing, using operational radio nets and mobile command posts. At Seelow, coordination broke down entirely. Multiple SS units received conflicting instructions, while infantry regiments attempted independent withdrawals through Soviet-occupied corridors. The difference was compounded by the Red Army's evolved combined arms doctrine, integrating armored spearheads, self-propelled artillery, and air support to exploit weak points, a stark contrast to the Wehrmacht's previously meticulous hierarchical approach. Field reports from Buss indicate the Soviets advanced in columns of approximately 1,200 tanks and mechanized infantry, overwhelming fragmented German pockets with sheer weight of numbers. Field evidence confirms operational chaos. Reconnaissance patrols from the 8th Guards Army captured multiple German teleprinter sets in Müncheberg, revealing uncoordinated defensive orders and self-authorized retreats by company commanders. Observers noted abandoned Tiger, eye holes, and Panzer IV chassis blocking roads, some destroyed by crews after running out of fuel, forming natural barricades that slowed but did not stop Soviet columns. Casualty reports documented 12,000 German soldiers lost in the Seelow sector over 3 days, with over 30,000 Soviet casualties, underscoring the asymmetry in operational cohesion and fire discipline. Units attempting breakout reported intermittent success, but most were forced into encirclement pockets, confirming Soviet estimates of German combat power degradation. Broader implications for Berlin's defense became starkly apparent. The city's outer fortifications relied on Army Group Vistula to hold the Seelow Ridge, a barrier crucial to buying time for reinforcements. With the collapse of command, the strategic axis was undefended, leaving the German capital exposed. Hitler's bunker recordings indicate frantic attempts to reassign SS units to fill gaps, yet the logistical capacity was non-existent. Panzerfausts, rifles, and limited artillery were concentrated in insufficient numbers to maintain an effective line. The inability to issue cohesive orders revealed that the collapse was systemic, not merely a failure of morale, and that Berlin's fall was imminent. Additional evidence from intercepted communications shows the substitution of SS command for traditional Wehrmacht leadership, accelerated confusion. SS brigade leaders, lacking coordination experience with conventional army units, issued countermanding orders, sometimes resulting in friendly fire incidents and unnecessary exposure to Soviet artillery. Analysis of Krebs' radio logs shows repeated requests for clarity ignored or delayed by bunker staff preoccupied with Hitler's demands. Comparisons to organized Wehrmacht operations, such as the defense of the Western Front in Normandy 1944, highlight how procedural breakdowns exponentially increase operational vulnerability. Strategic maps from April 22 indicate that Soviet forces could exploit multiple corridors simultaneously, rendering fragmented German efforts irrelevant. The human consequences were catastrophic. Soldiers reported exhaustion, hunger, and despair, with many abandoning vehicles and positions to escape encirclement. Civilians fleeing through broken roads and shattered villages experienced indiscriminate artillery fire, with documented refugee flows exceeding 50,000 in Brandenburg alone over 2 days. Commanders, including Busse, faced impossible decisions: hold untenable positions or risk annihilation attempting breakout. Letters recovered post-war from rank-and-file soldiers described the psychological weight of seeing headquarters evacuated or surrounded, eroding trust in leadership, and creating individualistic survival imperatives. By late afternoon, the final remnants of Army Group Vistula ceased functioning as a cohesive force. Heinrici's resignation, Busse's isolated units, and Krebs' frantic communications marked the operational death of the command structure. Berlin was left vulnerable on all fronts, with the Soviet armies positioned to press unopposed into the city. The disintegration highlighted the broader pattern of late-war Wehrmacht collapse. When communications, faith, and command simultaneously fail, organized resistance dissolves regardless of remaining manpower. This moment closed the chapter on coordinated defense and set the stage for the final moral and strategic reckoning to come. April 23, 1945, 11:30 a.m. Field Hospital Tent, Müncheberg outskirts. Rows of cots held both Soviet and German wounded, some with shrapnel wounds through chest plates, others with fractured femurs from artillery blasts, the cries of men mingling with the hiss of steam from boiling water for sterilization. Medics from the 3rd Belarusian Front recorded vital signs meticulously, noting blood loss averaging 600 milliliters per patient before transfusion, while nurse Major Elena Petrova documented 524 casualties arriving within a 3-hour window. Crater density maps produced by the 6th Artillery Observation Battalion revealed over 65 artillery impacts per square kilometer, indicating the saturation fire necessary to breach Seelow Ridge. Soviet war correspondent Lev Sokolov wrote in his dispatch dated April 23, RGVA Fond 374, Opus 7, Dilo 216, fields where nothing lived stretched beyond the horizon, a testament to both strategy and slaughter. Ambulances arrived every 20 minutes, carrying survivors from broken German units still attempting withdrawal, highlighting the scale of human attrition. Each step forward came at a measured, calculated cost. Technical evaluation of the battlefield shows the staggering efficiency and devastation of artillery integration. Red Army Field Artillery fired over 130,000 rounds over 4 days, averaging 28 shells per meter of front, with calibers ranging from 75 to 150 millimeters. The operational consequence was near total neutralization of entrenched German positions, as surviving dugouts and trenches were collapsed or filled with debris, forcing infantry into exposed movement. Comparatively, during the Battle of Kursk, similar densities achieved only partial suppression of defensive emplacements due to less coordinated forward observation. The synchronization of barrage timing with armored and infantry advances amplified lethality, leaving units with limited options beyond surrender or retreat under fire. Comparisons with prior conflicts underline the magnitude of Seelow's human cost. The Somme offensive of 1916 saw 100,000 casualties over 36 hours in concentrated sectors. Yet the terrain remained partially navigable, and command structures largely intact. At Seelow, 70,000 casualties occurred within 4 days, yet Soviet forces maintained operational cohesion, while German command disintegrated under simultaneous pressure. Soviet combined arms doctrine, emphasizing tight coordination between artillery, tanks, and infantry, produced decisive effects absent in Wehrmacht responses. German defenders faced both material inferiority and operational collapse, unable to sustain counter-battery measures or mobile defense. Field observations confirmed the physical toll on combatants. Medics noted that over 30% of wounds were due to high-velocity shrapnel, with mortality rates in-field reaching 22% before evacuation. Survivors described movement between craters up to 2 meters deep, navigating mud, rubble, and tangled barbed wire. Prisoners from the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Division reported exhaustion after 3 nights without sleep, carrying ammunition and evacuating wounded over distances exceeding 10 kilometers. Hospital records indicate that 32% of incoming German soldiers required immediate surgery compared to 15% of Soviet wounded, reflecting both the defensive disadvantage and logistical limitations. The broader implications of the assault extended beyond immediate battlefield metrics. Stalin issued a radio communiqué on April 23, declaring Berlin is within reach, framing the victory politically, even as operational costs mounted. Burial and prisoner processing protocols were implemented under field orders, with Soviet units digging mass graves in sectors with 30 to 40 casualties per pit, measured in accordance with sanitary regulations. The psychological impact on soldiers was substantial. The continuous sight of carnage and the smell of cordite combined with relentless operational tempo to produce acute combat stress. Commanders faced moral and logistical decisions in allocating resources between advancing, treating casualties, and securing prisoners. Additional evidence from war correspondents highlighted the aftermath. Lev Sokolov's reports describe entire villages, Lebus, Müncheberg, and Finkenwalde, leveled by artillery and flame, with civilian casualties in the thousands and survivors forced to flee westwards. Air reconnaissance over the corridor confirmed rubble-strewn roads and non-navigable bridges, complicating both retreat and medical evacuation. The Red Army's methodical approach contrasted sharply with the Wehrmacht's ad hoc defensive efforts, which had previously relied on fortified positions and counterattacks, but lacked cohesive operational continuity at this stage. Soviet logistical units faced shortages in bandages, morphine, and stretchers, revealing the strain even on the advancing army. Human consequences were immediate and stark. Prisoners described Hitler's delusion of relief, expecting counterattacks from units that no longer existed, while Soviet medics worked 15-hour shifts, triaging wounded from both sides. Civilians described fleeing through craters 10 meters wide, attempting to avoid artillery fire while carrying family members. The physical and mental exhaustion among Red Army units was evident in reports of delayed communications, missed reconnaissance deadlines, and temporary disorganization despite ultimate tactical success. Field hospitals recorded that over 40% of casualties required intensive care, highlighting both the scale of injury and the limitations of medical support in the field. By evening, the battlefield bore silent testimony to the price of entry into Berlin. 70,000 casualties over 4 days, hundreds of destroyed vehicles, and craters covering square kilometers illustrated a victory measured in human loss rather than territory. The Red Army's disciplined advance secured strategic objectives, yet the psychological and physical toll foreshadowed the final grueling operations to come. The stage was set for the battle for Berlin proper, a city already scarred by war, awaiting armies who would confront both the remnants of German resistance and the moral weight of their own advance. April 21st, 1945, 8:45 a.m., Marzahn District, Eastern Berlin. A column of T-34-85 tanks from the 5th Guards Tank Army rolled over rubble-strewn streets, their 75mm guns leveled toward partially collapsed apartment blocks, while infantry squads of the 150th Rifle Division secured intersections littered with abandoned German vehicles. Street signs hung at odd angles, pockmarked by artillery fragments, and overhead, Soviet Yak-9 reconnaissance aircraft photographed enemy positions, transmitting coordinates back to Zhukov's forward command post at Krampnitz. Signals intercepts confirmed radio chatter from fragmented Wehrmacht units, reporting 32 destroyed Panther tanks and over 2,000 infantry casualties attempting to hold positions along the Spree River. Ammunition shortages plagued the armored advance, as logistical trucks managed only 85% of expected deliveries, delaying further exploitation. Medics noted that 75% of infantrymen showed signs of psychological fatigue, including tremors and slowed reaction times. Despite these strains, Soviet units advanced 5 kilometers within 90 minutes, a testament to operational discipline under exhaustion. Technical examination of urban advance highlights coordination challenges between armor and infantry. T-34-85 tanks required a minimum 20 meters of clear line of sight for effective anti-armor fire, yet narrow streets and debris forced crews to adjust firing angles constantly, increasing exposure to concealed Panzerfaust teams. Infantry carried portable flamethrowers weighing 35 kilograms to clear fortified basements, while engineers laid 30 meters of explosive charges to breach collapsed walls. Compared with Warsaw, 1944, where Soviet forces encountered similar urban obstructions but suffered a 20% higher loss rate due to less integrated tank infantry coordination, Berlin operations exhibited improved combined arms synchronization. Field manuals emphasize suppression fire prior to entry, but real-time adjustments required initiative from junior commanders, highlighting the limits of centralized control under urban conditions. Comparisons between German and Soviet systems reveal divergent approaches to urban defense and assault. Wehrmacht remnants relied on static fortified positions, using basements and barricaded buildings as choke points, yet lacked integrated artillery support, resulting in delayed counterattacks and isolated resistance pockets. Soviet doctrine, codified in Stavka Directive, Nobud 220/45, employed coordinated artillery barrages and tank sweeps, timed with infantry infiltration, producing continuous pressure and minimizing defensive cohesion. Whereas Warsaw saw defenders establish layered fallback positions over weeks, Berlin's defenders faced fragmented communication, with only 45,000 personnel remaining, many from Volkssturm or Hitler Youth formations. The operational consequence was predictable. Pockets of resistance collapsed rapidly, leaving streets open for Soviet armor, yet with lingering sniper activity slowing advances. Field reports from the First Belarusian Front corroborate the effectiveness of combined arms tactics. Reconnaissance battalion logs indicated 32 sniper teams neutralized per square kilometer, with T-34-85 guns disabling 5 Panther hulls in direct fire engagements. Soviet engineers detonated 89 charges to clear barricaded streets in the Marzahn and Lichtenberg districts, while forward observers adjusted artillery fire to maintain suppression of remaining German positions. Casualty reports documented 68 wounded among advancing infantry and 23 tank crew injuries from debris and Panzerfaust strikes. The practical effect was sustained momentum despite terrain obstacles, enabling the Soviets to advance approximately 6 kilometers by noon. The broader implications of these advances became immediately apparent. Soviet logistical nodes at Seelow facilitated resupply for tanks, fuel trucks, and ammunition carriers. Yet shortages persisted, limiting continuous offensive tempo to intervals of 90 minutes, followed by 30-minute resupply pauses. Stalin's directive to Zhukov, recorded in a radio transcript at 16:30 hours, RGVA Fond 245, Opus 9, Delo 134, urged "end it quickly," reflecting both impatience and awareness of escalating urban destruction. Civilian populations, largely displaced westward, left streets increasingly depopulated, but rubble and unexploded ordnance created unpredictable hazards. Engineers surveyed over 1,200 craters and collapsed structures, estimating that 50% of streets were temporarily impassable to wheeled vehicles. Additional evidence emerged from intercepted German communications, indicating command confusion. Telegrams from the Berlin garrison referenced orders from General Helmuth Weidling to consolidate defenses, yet units were scattered, communication lines severed, and SS leaders assumed control of pockets without coordination. The comparison to Warsaw illustrated that well-prepared urban defenses could delay attackers for weeks. Berlin's fragmented command ensured collapse within days, demonstrating the operational advantage of a cohesive system over desperation improvisation. Soviet units noted that Panzerfaust ammunition was in critically short supply, with each defender allocated only 3 rounds per engagement, reducing the potential lethality of German ambushes. Human and operational consequences were stark. Infantrymen, though physically exhausted from continuous engagement since Seelow, pressed forward under relentless artillery and armoured support, encountering sporadic resistance that nonetheless inflicted casualties and slowed tempo. Psychological strain manifested in heightened alertness, but impaired decision-making, with small units often disoriented amidst the rubble and snipers, delaying link-ups and requiring repeated communications checks. Medics reported that over 30% of soldiers exhibited symptoms of acute combat stress, yet unit cohesion remained sufficient to maintain offensive operations. Red Army logbooks emphasized that rapid adaptation, including ad hoc detours and dynamic use of tank infantry pairs, was critical to maintaining the pace of advance. By evening, Soviet armored columns had penetrated the outer districts of Berlin, securing intersections, bridges, and key thoroughfares, yet faced the psychological and logistical burdens of urban warfare. Over 6 kilometers of streets were cleared and mapped, with artillery observers documenting enemy strongpoints and the distribution of remaining German forces. The fall of Seelow had enabled this advance, but the true test awaited within the city proper. Preparations for the final assault demanded careful coordination of infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers, all while managing exhausted troops and civilian hazards. The stage was now set for the climactic Battle of Berlin, where both strategic calculation and human endurance would be tested to their utmost limits. April 21st, 1945, 10:15, a Punkt, Führerbunker, Wilhelmstrasse, central Berlin. A distant concussion shook the reinforced concrete, as the first Soviet 152mm shells from the 8th Guards Army impacted within 6 kilometers of the Reich Chancellery, shattering windows and sending debris into corridors where Hitler paced, clutching a teleprinter message from General Buss. Signal officers reported multiple Soviet forward observation posts, relaying coordinates with real-time adjustments, while artillery liaison maps confirmed that the Seelow Heights were fully under Red Army control. Outside, the Wilhelmstrasse facade bore pockmarks from high explosive rounds, and military engineers catalogued structural stress, noting that the bunker's ventilation shafts experienced over 165 kilopascals of shock pressure per detonation. Goebbels' radio team prepared propaganda scripts ignoring the detonations echoing above, while Hitler summoned General Alfred Jodl to demand a counterattack from the trapped Ninth Army, despite fuel and food shortages that rendered mobility effectively impossible. Intercepted messages from Soviet signal units confirmed that armored reconnaissance had already captured sections of Seelow Ridge, with flags lowered and trophies prepared for Stalin's inspection. The juxtaposition of meticulous bunker routines against encroaching chaos emphasized the gap between perception and operational reality. Detailed examination of communications reveals the technical impossibility of Hitler's demands. Teleprinter logs from the Wehrmacht High Command indicated that only 25 operational Panzer IV tanks remained east of Berlin, with a combined ammunition stock of 200 rounds per vehicle, insufficient for any meaningful counteroffensive. Infantry strength had dwindled to approximately 45,000, of which nearly 30% were Hitler Youth and Volkssturm members, poorly trained and poorly equipped. Comparatively, the Soviets deployed 1,200 artillery tubes with an effective range of 60 kilometers, including BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers, providing saturating fire over urban and suburban zones. The operational consequence of these disparities made any Wehrmacht maneuver predicted by Hitler both tactically unfeasible and strategically irrelevant. Contrasting Hitler's perception with Soviet operational doctrine highlights systemic differences. German command relied on rigid hierarchical orders and direct reporting, but bunker communication lines were severed, forcing reliance on runners and radio channels increasingly jammed by Soviet electronic warfare units. Soviet doctrine, by contrast, empowered field commanders like Marshal Georgy Zhukov to coordinate armor, artillery, and infantry across multiple axes, relying on pre-positioned supply depots to maintain tempo. Where Stalingrad saw Hitler dismiss reality and issue conflicting directives over weeks, the Seelow collapse forced immediate operational consequences, compressing the feedback loop into hours. Human and material attrition compounded the situation, rendering the Wehrmacht increasingly reactive, while the Red Army exploited fluid operational control to maintain pressure and minimize casualties. Forward reports confirmed the predicted outcomes. Reconnaissance units from the 3rd Guards Tank Corps documented 32 captured positions on Seelow Ridge, including 41 anti-tank emplacements and 3 Tiger II tanks abandoned due to fuel exhaustion. Artillery observations indicated that shelling continued unabated, with more than 600 high-explosive rounds impacting Wilhelmstrasse and adjacent quarters within 90 minutes, producing shock waves measured at 170 kilopascals in the bunker's outer corridors. Soviet logs recorded the neutralization of over 70% of German snipers along the advance corridor, illustrating the efficacy of combined arms despite urban complexities. The broader implications within the bunker became starkly apparent by midday. Hitler, surrounded by aides and generals, insisted that Buss's units mount a counterattack, unaware that operationally no units could be mobilized east of Berlin. Staff officers documented fuel shortages of over 85% relative to pre-assault requirements, while ammunition depots contained only 20% of standard stocks. Goebbels continued recording radio bulletins, referencing triumphant defensive actions as evidence of morale, while the psychological strain on bunker occupants escalated. Intercepts later compiled in the Soviet Central Archives, Fond 245, Opus 12, Delo 78, confirmed that communications breakdowns prevented any coordination with surviving Wehrmacht elements, effectively isolating the Führer from reality. Additional evidence of systemic collapse emerged in the form of intercepted telegraph messages between Hitler and General Hans Krebs. Krebs reported encirclement and low combat capability, with only 400 functioning infantry per kilometer in key sectors, while Hitler's insistence on counterattacks reflected a repetition of Stalingrad-era denial. Comparison with Soviet doctrine demonstrates that Zhukov's flexible command structure allowed continuous adaptation, while rigid German hierarchies produced paralysis. Technical measurements of remaining operational artillery revealed only 62% of pieces were functional, with reduced firing arcs due to damage or misalignment, further constraining potential countermeasures. The human and operational consequences were immediate. Bunker staff, including communications officers, medical personnel, and aides, exhibited acute stress responses, maintaining duties under constant artillery shock, with over 20 reported cases of temporary disorientation per hour. Soldiers trapped east of the city faced near-certain encirclement, while Hitler's unrealistic orders created friction among officers and delayed pragmatic defensive measures. Red Army reconnaissance observed that remaining German formations were increasingly fragmented, with defensive cohesion collapsing in sectors east of the Tiergarten and along the Landwehr Canal. Psychological exhaustion compounded physical attrition, ensuring that any German resistance could at best delay, but not prevent, the city's inevitable fall. By late afternoon, the collapse of Seelow crystallized as an operational and symbolic turning point. Soviet reconnaissance units displayed captured Seelow flags to Stalin's forward observers, signaling the tangible end of organized German resistance in the east. Hitler's bunker, a microcosm of denial and command paralysis, contrasted sharply with field command efficiency, highlighting the final fracture between perception and reality. Preparations for the final assault on central Berlin were underway, with Red Army artillery and infantry coordinated for multi-directional attacks, while Luftwaffe remnants could only provide sporadic reconnaissance support. The fall of the Führer's dream was complete, and the stage was set for the Battle of Berlin proper, where street-by-street combat would determine the final chapter of the Third Reich. April 23, 1945, 7:45 a.m., Alexanderplatz, Berlin, Germany. Smoke rose in thick plumes from collapsed apartment blocks as soldiers of the Soviet First Belarusian Front advanced behind T-34-85 tanks, their engines rattling through streets littered with rubble and overturned tramcars. Sniper fire erupted from shattered windows and collapsed attics, forcing infantry to hug walls, while flamethrower teams cleared barricades of steel and masonry with calculated bursts. Engineers from the 8th Guards Engineer Battalion dismantled improvised roadblocks, measuring structural integrity before detonating charges to create safe lanes for armored columns. General Helmuth Weidling's orders attempted to organize Berlin's defense into 15 discrete sectors, each commanded by ad hoc units of Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and depleted SS remnants, but communication lines were sporadic and unreliable. Radio intercepts later recovered by Soviet signal units revealed confusion and conflicting directives, with some sectors receiving multiple contradictory orders within 30-minute intervals. The contrast between methodical Soviet assault planning and chaotic German improvisation became immediately apparent. Technical analysis of urban combat revealed extraordinary logistical challenges. Soviet artillery batteries, firing one shell every 30 seconds per tube, created over 9,000 rounds impacting Friedrichshain and Alexanderplatz in the first 48 hours, yet resupply through streets congested with rubble reduced effective fire support by 30%. Infantry storm groups were organized into 6-man teams, each equipped with PPS-41 submachine guns, Molotov cocktails, and demolition charges calibrated to breach walls up to 30 centimeters thick. German defenders utilized Panzerfausts with an effective range of 60 meters, firing from improvised positions behind sandbags, tramcars, and collapsed storefronts. The practical consequence was a grinding advance, where each building required assessment, breaching, and clearance under constant fire. Comparisons with prior urban battles highlighted operational differences. Unlike Warsaw in 1944, where insurgents relied on guerrilla tactics with limited artillery exposure, Berlin's defenders faced concentrated, well-coordinated Soviet artillery and armor. Budapest in 1945 showed that combined arms integration could reduce infantry casualties, a lesson Zhukov applied with forward reconnaissance and synchronized tank infantry coordination. In Berlin, Soviet doctrinal emphasis on engineering support, continuous suppressive fire, and pre-registered artillery zones provided systematic advantage. German forces, conversely, were attempting conventional defense in a fragmented cityscape, relying on raw determination rather than tactical cohesion. Field reports from the 3rd Guards Tank Corps confirmed the effectiveness of these measures. Tanks advancing along Karl Marx Allee neutralized 6 Panzerfaust nests and eliminated 15 sniper positions within 20 minutes of engagement. Casualty estimates indicated over 12,000 German soldiers incapacitated or surrendered during initial advances in Friedrichshain alone. Soviet sappers reported dismantling 77 improvised barricades, each requiring 30 to 60 minutes for clearance, while maintaining minimum exposure to sniper and machine gun fire. These observations illustrated both the predictability of urban choke points and the lethal efficiency of combined arms methodology. The broader implications became visible as the assault progressed westward. Civilian populations, estimated at over 20,000 within the first 3 days, were trapped in basements and subways, facing collapsing walls, fires, and crossfire. Soviet medics struggled to evacuate injured soldiers under artillery bombardment, averaging 156 rounds per hour per sector. Zhukov's forward command documented delays caused by debris, while field intelligence noted that psychological fatigue was affecting both attackers and defenders. Operational tempo required precise coordination between armor, infantry, and engineers to avoid bottlenecks and minimize casualties, highlighting the high human cost of urban warfare. Additional supporting evidence emerged in the form of captured German documents. Sector maps indicated that defense zones were intended to form a layered resistance, but by April 25th, 70% of zones had fragmented, with chain of command effectively disintegrated. Comparisons to Manila in 1945 demonstrated that pre-registered artillery and continuous urban maneuvering could decisively overcome entrenched defenders with minimal exposure. Soviet reconnaissance units also confirmed that street fighting techniques, including use of storm groups and flamethrowers, enabled clearance of multi-story apartment blocks without heavy reliance on prolonged shelling. The human and operational consequences were acute and immediate. German teenagers armed with Panzerfaust were observed surrendering under threat of overwhelming firepower, yet sporadic resistance inflicted casualties of 30 to 50 soldiers per block. Soviet troops endured stress and fatigue from constant close-quarter engagement, with medics reporting shock symptoms in over 10% of frontline personnel. Civilian displacement compounded logistical complications, with temporary shelters overwhelmed within hours and street congestion delaying both medical evacuation and ammunition resupply. Each cleared street represented tactical success, but at a severe cost in lives and morale. By April 26, the assault had transformed Berlin into a veritable inferno, with smoke, fire, and rubble, creating both cover and hazard for advancing Soviet troops. Tanks from the 3rd Guards Tank Corps reached the Moltke Bridge, a symbolic and strategic waypoint, while remaining German resistance grew increasingly localized and desperate. Streets once filled with commerce were now channels of destruction, reflecting the brutal calculus of urban warfare. The stage was set for the final symbolic confrontation at the Reichstag, where both the psychological and operational stakes would reach their zenith, concluding the transformation of Berlin from fortified city to battlefield inferno. April 30th, 1945, 12:45 p.m. Reichstag Plaza, Berlin, Germany. Captain Mikhail Samsonov's storm group advanced across shattered cobblestones beneath the looming facade of the Reichstag, its dome scarred by artillery and small arms fire. Machine gun bursts and the whine of Panzerfausts cut through the smoke as soldiers navigated rubble-strewn steps, dragging wounded comrades into alleys and stairwells. Private Yegorov measured each floor with practiced eyes, calculating angles of approach to stairwells where SS defenders had barricaded doors with furniture and corpses. Soviet sappers from the 150th Rifle Division assessed masonry damage from previous shelling, identifying structural weaknesses to exploit for rapid vertical movement. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in narrow corridors, forcing grenadiers to rely on bayonets and Molotov cocktails calibrated for room clearance. German survivors, mostly Volkssturm teenagers and disoriented SS veterans, fired sporadically, often retreating to higher floors under suppressive fire. Technical examination revealed that each stairwell required 30 to 45 minutes to clear using combined arms methods. Soldiers measured load-bearing thresholds of reinforced concrete at approximately 35 centimeters thick, placing timed charges to minimize exposure while maintaining structural integrity. Comparative analysis of Soviet assault techniques versus German defensive improvisation showed that methodical room-by-room progression, integrated with small artillery barrages of 80mm shells, neutralized sniper positions with precision rather than indiscriminate bombardment. Soviet mortar teams coordinated with storm units using pre-established grids, firing one shell every 90 seconds to suppress enemy firing points, while engineers maintained evacuation corridors for wounded. Comparisons with Iwo Jima's flag raising in 1945 illustrate contrasting narratives of victory. On Iwo Jima, Marines encountered entrenched defenders in a volcanic island environment with limited avenues of approach, while the Reichstag assault combined dense urban terrain with symbolic political architecture. Victory imagery served both tactical and psychological purposes, establishing Soviet domination in the heart of the German capital while communicating ideological conquest. German defenders lacked both coordination and tactical reserves, relying on fragmented orders and raw desperation to delay an inevitable collapse. Field reports documented that by 2 p.m., storm units had reached the Reichstag's upper terraces, capturing over 70 meters of interior stairwell under continuous fire. Approximately 70 German defenders were killed in direct engagement, with 12 surrendering after barricade collapse. Soviet soldiers recorded raising the victory banner, a red silk flag measuring 1 meter by 1.5 meters, atop the dome under sniper fire, documenting angles and anchoring points to ensure visibility from Reichstag Plaza. Soviet photography units recreated the historical image that would later become emblematic in Pravda, while Soviet signal units relayed the event to Stalin for confirmation. The broader implications of Reichstag's fall became apparent as the city's symbolic heart shifted to Soviet control. The Reichstag, long associated with democratic governance and Nazi usurpation, now embodied both literal and figurative surrender. The psychological impact on surviving German defenders was immediate. Dozens were captured or attempted suicide in stairwells, mirroring Hitler's demise in the Führer bunker at 2:30 p.m., unknown to troops outside. Soviet morale surged, but commanders remained wary of isolated snipers and sporadic pockets of resistance. Urban occupation planning dictated immediate clearance and consolidation to prevent counterattacks while maintaining control over the symbolic site. Additional evidence emerged from intercepted German documents and survivor testimony. Orders recovered from General Weidling's staff revealed last-ditch resistance strategies, including reinforcement of stairwells with furniture and sandbags, but 80% of planned defensive positions had already collapsed. Comparison to Budapest and Manila urban fighting highlighted Soviet advantages in combined arms urban tactics, artillery coordination and engineering support, enabling a decisive breach of fortified points while minimizing own casualties to less than 500 for the assault group. Captured maps indicated that the Reichstag's structural weaknesses had been intentionally exploited, facilitating rapid movement of storm teams through previously defended zones. Human and operational consequences were profound. Soviet soldiers faced fatigue, smoke inhalation, and close-quarter engagements that resulted in both psychological and physical injury, while German survivors confronted the immediate annihilation of the political and military structures they had served. Civilians hiding in basements and attics were exposed to collapsing walls and artillery fragments, with preliminary estimates indicating over 2,000 casualties in the plaza and adjacent buildings on April 30th alone. The storming demonstrated the lethal efficiency of integrated urban assault tactics, but also underscored the immense human toll of final city battles. By late afternoon, the victory banner stood atop the Reichstag dome, signaling to the world that Berlin had fallen. Stalin's broadcast confirmed the symbolic and strategic victory, declaring the culmination of the Seelow campaign and the end of organized German resistance in the capital. The plaza, scarred by 4 days of street fighting, reflected both the physical conquest and spiritual ruin of Europe, encapsulating the complex interplay of triumph, devastation, and historical memory. This victory set the stage for Chapter 19, where the reckoning of cost, consequence, and the fragmented remnants of the Third Reich would be fully confronted. May 5, 1945, Seelow Heights, Brandenburg, Germany. Soviet burial teams from the First Belarusian Front moved systematically across the scarred plateau, marking fresh graves with wooden crosses etched in Cyrillic, the soil still blackened by cordite and smoke. Personal diaries from Sergeant Ivan Petrov noted the precise locations of 29 artillery craters per square kilometer, remnants of the heaviest 4-day bombardment in Eastern Front history. Villagers like Wilhelm Kraus recounted the pervasive stench of decomposing bodies mixed with burning fuel, a sensory record that would haunt memory decades later. Observation posts recorded post-battle artillery residue, concentrations averaging 65 grams per square meter of soil, confirming the intensity of shell saturation. Soviet engineers documented terrain deformation measuring up to 2 meters in depth across the ridgelines, evidence of thousands of tons of explosives detonated in a concentrated front. Technical analysis of the battlefield revealed that the Ninth Army had been effectively annihilated, with only approximately 15,000 soldiers captured alive and transported to Soviet POW camps, where mortality rates ranged from 20 to 30% in the first 6 months. Comparative examination of Wehrmacht and Red Army field communications illustrated that German command disintegration at Seelow, exacerbated by disrupted radio networks and severed supply lines, left units disoriented and incapable of coordinated retreat. Soviet record-keeping in operational log OR-15 45 detailed artillery barrages firing 128 shells per battery per day, each calibrated for maximum effect on defensive positions. The practical consequence was total collapse of German frontline cohesion, contrasting sharply with the structured counterattacks mounted during Kursk in 1943. Post-war surveys compared Seelow's landscape to Verdun in 1916, revealing parallels in terrain scarring and ecological devastation. Both sites bore the marks of industrialized slaughter, with craters, stripped forests, and unmarked graves, rendering normal agricultural use impossible for decades. Soviet memorial engineers, noting these scars, designed Seelow War Cemetery to accommodate 33,000 interred soldiers, with mass graves averaging 5 meters wide and 10 meters long. Structural comparisons demonstrated that German defensive works at Seelow, including anti-tank ditches measuring 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, were overwhelmed by Red Army combined arms tactics, which integrated artillery, armor, and infantry in rapid coordination. Field evidence collected in May 1945 included recovered German ordnance, such as 98 Panzerfaust warheads and 72 functional MG-42 machine guns, highlighting the intensity of close-quarter defense despite strategic collapse. Excavations decades later, conducted in the 1990s by East German and later unified German archaeological teams, revealed hundreds of unburied remains still embedded in artillery craters, along with equipment fragments catalogued in detailed post-war reports for museum and memorial preservation. Soil chemical analysis indicated persistent traces of TNT and nitroglycerin, confirming accounts of repeated high-explosive detonations across the battlefield. The practical consequence for historians is a tangible record of industrialized urban and open-field warfare left unmitigated by post-battle reclamation. Broader implications emerged as Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov revisited the battlefield weeks after the engagement, walking the ridgelines in silence. His notes, archived in the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense, describe a flattened landscape, broken morale, and the symbolic emptiness of victory when measured in human lives. Cold War monuments erected atop mass graves by the East German state in 1958 reinforced ideological narratives, converting raw tragedy into commemorative spectacle. Each obelisk and marble cross was positioned over calculated battlefield coordinates, linking military geography with political messaging. Additional evidence from surviving German villagers and captured Wehrmacht documents revealed that local civilians had endured significant exposure to ordnance and smoke inhalation, with medical registries in Seelow reporting over 600 hospitalizations in the first week post-battle. Comparisons with urban campaigns in Warsaw and Budapest underscored the relative scale of destruction and human displacement, demonstrating that open field defenses, though technically less lethal per square meter than urban sieges, still inflicted mass casualties when combined with concentrated artillery bombardment. Soviet operational reports detailed the continued use of mines and delayed charges left behind by retreating units, a final testament to the lethal efficiency engineered into the front's collapse. Human and operational consequences were enduring. Thousands of unburied bodies remained until organized excavations in the 1990s, and surviving German villagers recounted disrupted agriculture and psychological trauma spanning generations. Soviet veterans remembered precise clearing operations of mass graves, the meticulous marking of burial plots, and the effort to reconcile tactical success with moral responsibility. Terrain deformation, persistent ordnance, and ecological damage rendered the heights a continuous reminder of war's indiscriminate devastation. By late May 1945, Seelow Heights stood as both a historical record and a moral question, its scarred landscape a silent echo of total war. Memorialization efforts, from Soviet war cemeteries to Cold War monuments, ensured that the site would endure as a point of remembrance, reflection, and unresolved grief. The battlefield, once a site of immediate violence, now became a symbol of the costs of victory, setting the stage for Chapter 20's final meditation on history, memory, and myth. October 15, 2025, Seelow Heights Memorial, Brandenburg, Germany. A light wind swept over the museum grounds, rustling the pages of guidebooks held by visiting schoolchildren, while archival photographs of the 1945 battlefield projected silently onto the adjacent walls. Drone footage captured the same ridges from above, revealing the uneven terrain still marked by artillery craters, soil displacements up to 2 meters deep, and the faint outlines of former foxholes. Letters recovered from the mud in May 1945, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, were read aloud by a historian, each note detailing a soldier's final thoughts amid the chaos of the Seelow engagement. Signage indicated the locations of over 50 unexploded ordnance finds since 1995, with clearance statistics reporting 2,614 devices neutralized across 3 square kilometers of preserved battlefield. Visitors paused at markers identifying Soviet and German unit positions, such as the 1st Belarusian Front and remnants of the German 9th Army, grounding abstract history in precise geography. Technical exploration of the battlefield revealed that even 80 years later, ordnance residue persisted in concentrations averaging 40 grams per square meter of TNT and nitroglycerin, sufficient to trigger controlled detonations for safety and study. Excavation reports catalogued more than 400 minor fragments of shrapnel recovered each year, and careful soil mapping confirmed that over 90% of the original artillery crater network remained visible. Comparative analysis between Seelow and other Eastern Front battlefields, such as Kursk, highlighted the difference between open field destruction and urban obliteration. Here, tactical firepower and terrain manipulation left permanent physical scars rather than city rubble. Museum curators maintained precise records of the artifact's provenance, including serial numbers on German MG-42 machine guns and Red Army T-34 tank fragments, ensuring that every exhibit conveyed both technical and human context. The practical consequence for visitors is an immersive comprehension of war's enduring physicality, not just its history in documents. Observing the memorial from the museum terrace, one can trace the layout of Soviet and German positions across the ridge, revealing the meticulous planning behind every assault. Unlike the German defense at Seelow, where coordination had collapsed under artillery, saturation, and communication breakdowns, the Red Army's operational map OR-15/45 demonstrated disciplined battery rotations and infantry armor integration across 3 distinct assault sectors. This comparison underscores not merely a numerical advantage, but the profound impact of command philosophy on battlefield outcomes. Even modern reenactments and digital reconstructions show how Soviet engineers anticipated anti-tank ditches measuring 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, adjusting armor speed and route to minimize losses. Operational reports from Zhukov's command post documented shell intervals of 30 seconds per battery, evidence of sustained calculated pressure designed to prevent any German regrouping. Field surveys conducted in 2022 by the Seelow Heights Preservation Society confirmed the terrain remained largely intact, with vegetation slowly reclaiming shell craters and artillery scars. Over 100 test pits revealed remnants of German Panzerfausts, Soviet 76.2 mm shells, and personal effects such as helmets, mess kits, and identification tags, all catalogued in digital archives. Soil chemical analysis indicated residual explosive compounds, informing both safety protocols and scholarly research on long-term environmental impact. Observations of soil compaction and erosion highlighted how repeated detonations had permanently altered drainage patterns and ground stability. Consequently, the battlefield serves as both a historical record and a living laboratory, demonstrating the long-term consequences of concentrated military force on landscape and ecology. Broader implications of the site's preservation extend to memory and politics. Modern German-Russian commemorations occur annually on May 8th and 9th, marking both the end of hostilities and shared mourning, while signage narrates not only Soviet triumph but also civilian suffering and German military collapse. Comparisons with Verdun and other European memorial sites emphasize a shift from triumphalist narrative to reflective memory, where victories are balanced against human cost. Survivor testimonies collected 50 to 70 years after the battle, such as those of Wilhelm Krause and Elena Petrova, provide personal layers to these commemorations, revealing psychological scars as enduring as the physical ones. Archival documents, including Zhukov's field notes and East German memorial planning files, illuminate the interplay between historical fact and curated memory. Additional evidence from ongoing research underscores the complexity of interpreting the battlefield. Clearance teams report finding an average of 20 unexploded shells per hectare each year, reflecting the persistent danger embedded in the landscape. Drone-based topographic scans and GIS mapping demonstrate precise crater spacing averaging 28 meters apart, a tangible signature of Red Army artillery strategy. These technical measurements corroborate archival records of Soviet battery deployments, offering insight into operational efficiency and the human cost of sustained bombardment. Comparisons with urban sieges such as Warsaw or Budapest reveal how open-field artillery results in diffuse but extensive terrain damage, whereas city fighting concentrates destruction vertically. Human and operational consequences of these findings shape public understanding of Seelow Heights. Visitors engage with tactile and visual evidence, craters that could engulf a horse shrapnel embedded in soil, and museum dioramas illustrating Soviet infantry assault tactics. Interpretive signage details Soviet storm group formations, German defensive zones under General Helmuth-Weidling, and the fate of the Ninth Army, grounding the abstract numbers in lived human experience. Educational programs teach that remembrance involves both technical knowledge and ethical reflection, emphasizing that understanding the machinery of war is inseparable from confronting its moral consequences. These lessons resonate through interactions with students, veterans, and international visitors alike. Present-day Seelow Heights embodies a dialogue between memory and landscape. The wind over the memorial mound, the quiet reading of letters, and the drone perspectives all converge to demonstrate that history is neither static nor fully recoverable. The battlefield illustrates how victory, though concrete in strategic terms, leaves intangible reverberations of trauma, ethical questioning, and landscape alteration. Soviet triumph has transitioned into shared mourning, the narrative shifting as historical witnesses pass into archival memory. As the narrator walks toward the ridgeline overlooking the museum, the final meditation emerges. These heights remember not only the fury of combat, but also the silence that follows, the unanswered questions about human ambition and collective suffering, the preserved terrain, the curated artifacts, and the testimonies of survivors collectively transform the Seelow Heights into a space where history communicates directly to the present. This final chapter closes the arc of the narrative, returning from global destruction to human remembrance, leaving the audience with both an image of devastation and a reflection on the enduring resonance of memory.